Consider the morning commute of the average person in any modern city, moving through traffic with urgent purpose, coffee in hand, mind already racing through the day's obligations and anxieties about deadlines that feel monumentally important in the present moment. This person sits in their vehicle or stands in a crowded train, mentally rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet, worrying about emails that may never arrive, constructing elaborate narratives about future scenarios that will almost certainly never occur exactly as imagined. The fundamental mechanism operating beneath this everyday scene is a peculiar form of psychological denial, a systematic refusal to acknowledge a single unchangeable fact that has remained constant across all of human history: that this person, like everyone else on that train or in that traffic, is moving inexorably toward their own death. This is not pessimism, but rather observable reality, yet somehow we have constructed an entire civilization designed almost perfectly to distract us from this awareness, filling every moment with notifications, entertainment, obligations, and manufactured urgencies that serve primarily to keep our minds occupied with anything except this central truth. We normalize this denial so thoroughly that to speak openly about mortality is considered morbid or depressing, even though the ancient Stoics understood that regularly contemplating your own finitude was not a path to despair, but rather to clarity and peace. When you truly sit with the knowledge that your time is finite, that your body will eventually fail, that this current moment is quite literally a portion of your life being spent and never recovered, something shifts in how you evaluate what actually deserves your attention and emotional energy. Imagine yourself standing at a crossroads in life where something you did not want has happened, something that disrupts your plans and fills you with resistance and resentment, and in that moment you feel the weight of wishing things were different, of pushing against reality itself with the force of your mind. This is the human condition we know so well, the constant negotiation between what we hoped would occur and what actually does, and most of us spend our days in this exhausting dialogue with fate. We encounter a traffic delay that makes us late, a relationship that ends unexpectedly, a health diagnosis we never anticipated, a failure at work that wounds our pride, and our first instinct is always to reject it, to feel that the universe has wronged us somehow. Yet the Stoic philosophers understood something profound about this resistance, recognizing that our suffering does not come from the events themselves, but from our judgment about those events, from our insistence that things should have been otherwise. The mechanism at work here is subtle but powerful. When we resist what has already happened, we are essentially expending tremendous mental and emotional energy on something that cannot be changed, something that exists now only in the realm of past fact. Our minds become divided against reality, creating an internal friction that exhausts us far more than the actual circumstance ever could. What Amor fati teaches us, this love of fate, is the radical acceptance that what has occurred was always part of the unfolding of existence, and rather than wasting our energy on futile resistance, we might instead ask what this situation offers us, what we might learn, how it might redirect us towards something we could not have foreseen. And yet, despite understanding this logic, despite the clear reasonableness of accepting what cannot be changed, we continue to resist, to replay the moments in our minds, to construct elaborate narratives about how th. Imagine yourself standing at a great height, perhaps on a mountain peak or in an aircraft ascending through clouds, where the world below becomes suddenly smaller and the landscape transforms into something almost unrecognizable in its miniature form. From this vantage point, the buildings that seemed so imposing when you walked beneath them become mere geometric shapes, the streets that felt endless compress into thin lines, and the people moving about their daily business become invisible specks of motion. This is the view from above, and it fundamentally alters how we perceive our immediate circumstances and concerns. When we gain this elevated perspective, something remarkable happens to our sense of scale and urgency. The traffic jam that frustrated you, the critical comment from a colleague, the embarrassment you felt in a meeting, the argument with a loved one, all of these become contextually smaller when held against the vastness of the landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. The psychological mechanism at work here is a shift in what philosophers and psychologists call reference frames. Our minds are naturally calibrated to our immediate sensory experience, so when we are at ground level concerns feel proportionally important and consuming. But when we elevate our physical or mental position, the mathematical relationship changes. The same concerns occupy less of our perceptual field, less of our mental bandwidth, and consequently, less of our emotional energy. We realize with striking clarity that countless other people below are experiencing their own overwhelming moments simultaneously, that the universe continues its rotation indifferent to our particular troubles, that the sun will rise and set regardless of how today's anxieties resolve. Consider the quiet moments before sleep when your mind drifts toward thoughts of mortality, toward the inevitable end that awaits every living thing, and notice how your breath quickens, how a subtle tension spreads through your chest, how the darkness of your room suddenly feels less like rest and more like a rehearsal of what is to come. This fear of death, this primal anxiety that grips even the most rational mind, stems from a fundamental confusion about what death actually is. For death is precisely nothing, and in understanding this truth, the ancient Stoics discovered a pathway toward genuine tranquility. When you examine death closely, you find that it contains no qualities whatsoever, no pain, no sensation, no experience of any kind, because the moment consciousness ceases, there is no entity present to experience anything at all. The Stoic philosopher understood that what we truly fear is not death itself, but the imagined process of dying, the pain, the struggle, the separation from those we love, the anxiety and anticipation that precede the final moment. We suffer not from death but from the thought of death, from our projection of non-existence into a thing that can be feared, when in reality non-existence is the complete absence of all suffering, all worry, all the burdens that consciousness carries. Yet we have normalized this fear so completely that we rarely question it, passing it from generation to generation like an inherited legacy, speaking in hushed tones about the unknown, building entire industries and belief systems around the dread of something that is quite literally nothing at all. The paradox deepens when you recognize that you have already experienced nothingness countless times, in the dreamless sleep that comes to you each night, in the moments before consciousness emerged in your childhood, in the billions of years before your birth, and yet these experiences contain no terror for you now, no residue of pain or fee. Consider the moments throughout your day when you find yourself gripped by anxiety about futures that have not yet arrived, scenarios where you imagine loss, failure, or disappointment with such vivid clarity that your body responds as though these events are happening in the present moment, causing your heart to quicken and your mind to spiral through increasingly catastrophic outcomes that exist only in the landscape of your imagination. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, sometimes called Premeditatio malorum, invites you to engage deliberately with this natural human tendency, not to amplify your suffering, but to transform it into something purposeful and clarifying. Rather than allowing fear to ambush you in moments of weakness, you sit quietly and consciously imagine the loss of things you cherish, the failure of plans you hold dear, the disappearance of people you love, approaching these difficult mental exercises with the calm attention of a philosopher rather than the panic of someone fleeing from truth. What unfolds through this contemplation is a peculiar psychological alchemy, for when you willingly confront the possibility of loss while safe and undisturbed, something shifts in your nervous system. Your mind recognizes that you can survive the thought of these things, that you possess the capacity to endure even scenarios that seem unbearable, and this recognition itself becomes a source of quiet strength. The mechanism at work here rests upon a simple truth that modern psychology has only recently validated through research into anxiety and resilience. We suffer more acutely in the avoidance of difficult thoughts than in their actual contemplation, and the mind that has already rehearsed hardship tends to respond with greater equanimity when genuine difficulty arrives. Consider the moment when you receive news that troubles you deeply, perhaps a critical email from your employer or a text message that suggests someone you care about is upset with you, and you find yourself lying awake at night replaying the conversation in your mind, imagining alternative words you might have chosen, constructing elaborate scenarios about how this situation might unfold, and spending hours in mental anguish over an outcome that has not yet occurred and may never occur at all. This experience reveals a fundamental truth about human suffering that the ancient Stoics understood with remarkable clarity. We expend enormous psychological energy attempting to control things that exist entirely outside the sphere of our influence, while often neglecting the one domain where we possess absolute authority, which is the domain of our own thoughts, judgments, and responses. The mechanism at work here is surprisingly simple, yet profoundly powerful, because your mind naturally gravitates toward what feels urgent and emotionally significant, even when that urgency is entirely self-generated and the emotional significance serves no practical purpose. When you worry about how someone might judge you, You are essentially trying to control another person's mind, a task as impossible as holding water in an open hand, yet we continue this futile effort because anxiety creates an illusion of agency, a false sense that our rumination might somehow prevent the negative outcome we fear. What is remarkable is how thoroughly we have normalized this pattern of suffering, how we speak casually of stress and worry as though they were inevitable taxes on existence rather than voluntary expenditures of our mental resources. We discuss our insomnia with the fatalism of someone describing the weather, as though we are merely victims of circumstance rather than the architects of our own sleeplessness. And yet the Stoic framework offers a different path. Consider the moment when you lie awake at night, your mind circling endlessly around a conversation that happened earlier in the day, replaying words you wish you had said differently, imagining how the other person must have judged you, constructing elaborate scenarios of how your reputation might be damaged by what was spoken. Your chest tightens, your breathing becomes shallow, and you feel a genuine sense of distress and anxiety, all while your body remains still in bed and nothing new is actually happening in the present moment. You are suffering not from any real threat, but from your attachment to controlling how others perceive you, which is fundamentally beyond your power. The words have already been spoken, the moment has passed, and yet you persist in the exhausting work of trying to retroactively reshape what cannot be reshaped. This is the human condition when we fail to distinguish between what lies within our control and what does not. Within your control are your judgments about the event, your interpretation of what it means, your choice to release it or to grip it tighter, your ability to learn from the interaction and decide differently in the future. Beyond your control are the thoughts of others, their emotional reactions, their memories of what you said, their choices about whether to forgive you or hold grudges. Yet we spend our energy almost exclusively on the latter, the realm of things we cannot influence, while neglecting the former, which is entirely ours to shape. This peculiar allocation of our mental resources persists because we have been conditioned since childhood to care intensely about external judgment and approval, and this conditioning runs so deep that it feels like truth itself rather than learned behavior. We have normalized the exhausting pursuit of controlling the uncontrollable, treating it as simply part of being human, when in fact it is the source of most of our unnecessary suffering. Consider the simple biological fact that exists within you at this very moment. Your cells are aging, your body is gradually declining, and your life is moving inexorably toward its conclusion. This is not a metaphor or a dramatic statement, but rather an observable reality that begins the moment you are born and continues without interruption until your final breath. Every second that passes is a second you will never experience again. Every heartbeat brings you closer to your last one, and every sunrise you witness is one fewer sunrise you have remaining in your life. The ancient Stoics understood this with a clarity that modern life encourages us to forget or deny, and they recognized that this truth, when properly contemplated, becomes not a source of despair, but rather a source of profound wisdom and liberation. The psychological mechanism behind our resistance to this truth is remarkably efficient. Your mind has developed sophisticated defense mechanisms to protect you from the constant awareness of mortality, creating a buffer of distraction and denial that allows you to function day to day without being paralyzed by existential dread. You fill your hours with obligations, entertainment, social media, work concerns, and countless small worries that keep your attention firmly planted in the immediate and the urgent. The mind treats mortality as something that happens to other people, something distant and abstract, something that exists in the future but not now, not today, not in this present moment when you have so much to do and think about. Yet this denial has no logical foundation whatsoever, and we continue to practice it despite having all the evidence we need to understand its fundamental falseness. You have watched people you know grow old and pass away. You have attended funerals and felt the undeniable weight of loss. You have read about death statistics and observed aging in everyone around you. Consider the moment when you first awaken, that liminal space between sleep and wakefulness where your mind is still soft and undefended, before the day's demands begin their relentless assault on your attention and energy. This is the precise window in which the ancient Stoics understood that a morning meditation ritual holds extraordinary power, not because of any mystical property inherent in the early hours, but because your mind at this vulnerable threshold is most receptive to deliberate instruction about how you wish to meet the day ahead. When you sit quietly in those first moments of consciousness, before checking your devices or reading the news or speaking with anyone else, you are essentially making a contract with yourself about your values and intentions, establishing a mental framework through which all subsequent experiences will be filtered and interpreted. The mechanism at work here is straightforward and rooted in basic psychology. Whatever ideas you deliberately plant in your mind first thing in the morning will establish the neural pathways and emotional set point that colors your perception of everything that follows. Much like the first color you paint on a canvas influences how all subsequent colors interact with it. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus both insisted on this practice because they recognized that without this intentional morning orientation toward virtue and reason, you will simply default to reactive patterns established by years of unconscious habit and social conditioning. Yet despite having access to this understanding, most modern people still rush through their mornings in a fog of distraction, allowing their minds to be seized immediately by external demands and stimuli, as though the first moments of their day have no bearing on anything that follows, as though consciousness and intention are luxuries rather than the very foundation upon which a meaningful existence is built. As the day draws to a close and you prepare yourself for sleep, consider the practice of reviewing the hours that have passed with the same careful attention a merchant might give to accounting his ledger at day's end. This ancient Stoic discipline invites you to move through the events of your day in reverse, beginning with the moment just before you lay your head down and traveling backward through time, observing each interaction, each decision, each moment of emotion with the detached curiosity of a witness rather than a judge. You might ask yourself whether you responded with virtue when someone irritated you, whether you spoke truthfully when convenience might have suggested otherwise, whether you maintained your composure when circumstances threatened to overwhelm you, and whether you acted in accordance with your principles even when no one was watching. The mechanism underlying this practice operates on a fundamental principle of human psychology. What we observe and reflect upon becomes integrated into our understanding of ourselves, creating a gentle feedback loop that gradually shapes our future behavior without the harshness of self-condemnation. By reviewing without judgment, simply noting where you aligned with your values and where you fell short, you create the conditions for natural improvement rather than defensive denial. Yet in our modern world, we have largely abandoned this practice entirely, treating the end of each day as merely the dimming of consciousness rather than an opportunity for genuine self-knowledge, filling our evenings instead with screens and distractions that prevent any genuine reflection. We have normalized the idea that sleep should be an escape from awareness rather than a transition into deeper understanding, accepting the notion that tomorrow we will simply begin anew without learning anything from what came before. Imagine yourself sitting alone in your room on a quiet evening, and somewhere across the city, a friend experiences a moment of profound sadness, and without any phone call or message, you feel a sudden heaviness in your chest, a pull toward reaching out to them, a sense that something is not quite right in the world around you. This sensation of connection that transcends distance and explanation is what the ancient Stoics called Sympatheia, the universal interconnectedness of all living things and all matter in the cosmos. The Stoics understood that we are not isolated islands of consciousness moving through an indifferent universe, but rather individual expressions of a single underlying rational principle that animates all existence, a cosmic web so fundamental that the suffering of one inevitably ripples through the whole, and the peace of one contributes to the harmony of all. This concept emerged not from mysticism, but from careful observation and logic, for the Stoics recognized that atoms and energy move between all things, that we breathe air that has touched countless lungs before ours, that our bodies return to the earth and become part of other living beings, that our thoughts influence the world around us through our actions and presence. Yet despite this ancient wisdom grounded in both physics and reason, we persist in our modern age in treating ourselves as fundamentally separate, competing entities, building walls between ourselves and others, hoarding resources as though plenty for one must mean scarcity for another, and nursing grievances as though hurting others could somehow protect us from harm. The tragedy is not that this interconnectedness fails to exist, but rather that we have simply forgotten its existence, normalized the illusion of separation so completely that we rarely question it, that we scroll through news of distant suffering with the same emotional distance we reserve for fictional characters. Consider the moment when your path forward is suddenly blocked, when what you plan to do becomes impossible, when the very thing you were counting on crumbles before you. Your instinct is to see this as a setback, a disruption, a problem to be solved or endured, you experience the weight of frustration because the world has not cooperated with your intentions. Yet the Stoic philosophers understood something profound about these moments that we have largely forgotten in our modern pursuit of frictionless living. They recognized that obstacles are not interruptions to the path of progress, but rather the path itself, and that what blocks your way becomes the very material through which you advance. When a door closes before you, it forces you to develop skills you would never have cultivated had it remained open. When your preferred route is blocked, you discover alternative routes that were always there but invisible to you. When your strength is tested by resistance, that resistance becomes the condition through which your strength actually grows. This principle operates at every level of human experience, from the small daily frustrations that teach you patience and creativity to the major life disruptions that fundamentally reshape who you are. The psychological mechanism is simple yet almost always overlooked. The obstacle removes your ability to sleepwalk through life, to coast on assumptions, to remain passive. It demands your full presence and your creative response. It calls forth capacities within you that would otherwise lie dormant. Yet despite this clear logic, despite centuries of evidence that our greatest growth comes through our greatest challenges, we persist in treating obstacles as aberrations, as signs that something has gone wrong with the universe, rather than recognizing them as the universe's way of offering us the education we truly need. Consider the person who wakes before dawn in winter darkness, stepping into a cold shower despite having access to hot water, or the athlete who chooses to run in rain when shelter is available, or the individual who sits in silence without distraction when entertainment surrounds them. These are not acts born of necessity or deprivation, but rather deliberate choices to experience discomfort when comfort remains entirely within reach. The Stoic philosophers understood something that modern life has largely forgotten, that our relationship with difficulty shapes our capacity to endure it. When we voluntarily embrace small hardships, we transform our psychology in subtle but profound ways. The body adapts to temperature fluctuation, the mind grows accustomed to boredom and restlessness, and our sense of what constitutes an actual problem fundamentally shifts. This practice works through a mechanism of desensitization and perspective recalibration. When you have chosen cold water deliberately, an unexpectedly cold shower becomes merely weather rather than a crisis. When you have sat with your own thoughts in voluntary solitude, unexpected silence becomes a gift rather than anxiety. The practice builds what might be called psychological resilience or antifragility, a capacity not merely to endure difficulty, but to have become so familiar with it that difficulty loses its power to disturb your peace. Yet despite the logical clarity of this principle, modern life has constructed itself around the elimination of discomfort at every possible moment. We have created systems and technologies specifically designed to insulate us from any unpleasant sensation or experience. Air conditioning, heated seats, instant entertainment, and constant connectivity exist as barriers between ourselves and anything remotely inconvenient. We have normalized the expectation that comfort should be the default state, and anything less represents a failure or injustice. Consider the ordinary evening when you lie in bed, your body finally still after hours of motion, yet your mind remains restless and divided, fragmented across yesterday's conversations, tomorrow's obligations, and the endless catalog of what you did not accomplish today. You find yourself mentally rehearsing an exchange with a colleague that occurred 8 hours ago, or constructing elaborate scenarios about a meeting scheduled for next week, while simultaneously your awareness of your actual physical sensations, the weight of blankets, the temperature of the room, your breath moving slowly in and out, remains dim and nearly forgotten. This splitting of consciousness, this pulling of attention in multiple temporal directions simultaneously, creates a peculiar exhaustion where your body rests, but your mind finds no genuine relief because it inhabits no single moment fully. The Stoic understanding of this condition reveals something fundamental about human suffering. Most of our distress does not originate from what is actually happening in the present instant, but rather from our mental presence in moments that do not exist. When you worry about the future, you're not responding to reality, but to a constructed story that may never unfold, and when you regret the past, you're fighting against events that are already beyond all possible influence. Yet this pattern persists even when we understand its illogical nature, because the mind has developed a powerful habit of treating imagined scenarios as though they demand our immediate emotional response and strategic planning. We have normalized this fragmentation of consciousness, even celebrated it under names like prudence and preparation, rarely pausing to notice that true prudence exists only when we perceive what is actually occurring and respond from our full, undivided presence rather than from anxious mental simulation of possibilities. Consider the moment you find yourself replaying a conversation from years ago, feeling the same shame or regret as though it were happening right now, your body tensing with the same anxiety you experienced then, your mind convinced that this old event somehow diminishes your worth in the present moment. You lie awake reconstructing what you said, what you should have said instead, imagining how differently your life might have unfolded had you spoken differently, acted differently, been different. The ancient Stoics understood something profound about this tendency. The past exists now only as a story you are telling yourself, a narrative constructed entirely within your mind in this present moment. The events themselves have already dissolved into nothingness. What remains is purely the interpretation you have chosen to maintain, the meaning you have assigned, the judgment you continue to render upon those events and upon yourself for participating in them. The psychological mechanism at work here is that your mind possesses an extraordinary capacity for temporal collapse, for collapsing the distance between what once happened and what you are experiencing now, blending memory with present emotion until they become indistinguishable. You treat the past as though it still possesses power over you, as though it continues to shape reality, when in truth you are the one granting it that power through your attention and your belief. We have normalized this illusion so thoroughly that we rarely question it, accepting as inevitable the burden of carrying our history with us, believing ourselves defined by our mistakes, our failures, our lost opportunities. Yet consider what actually exists in this moment. The memory itself, yes, but also your freedom to release it, to reinterpret it, or to simply let it fade. The past cannot touch you unless you insist on reaching backward to touch it first. Consider how much of your waking life is consumed by thoughts of what has not yet occurred, by mental rehearsals of conversations you have not had, by anxieties about outcomes that exist only in the architecture of your mind. You spend hours constructing elaborate scenarios about tomorrow, next month, next year, investing emotional energy into events that may never transpire, that may transform completely once they arrive, or that may prove entirely different from what you imagined during those sleepless nights of anticipation. The future, in this sense, is not a place you can visit or truly know. It is a story your mind tells itself, a narrative constructed from fragments of past experience and present fear, yet treated with the certainty of established fact. When you lie awake worrying about a presentation at work, you are not actually experiencing that presentation. You are experiencing only your thoughts about it, your projections, your interpretations of how others might judge you, all of which are filtered through your current mood, your insecurities, your particular way of organizing reality. The mechanism at work here is the mind's tendency to treat imagination as prophecy, to confuse the map with the territory, to believe that because you have thought something vividly enough, it has already become real in some meaningful sense. This is how anxiety persists and proliferates. We grant our imaginations the authority of truth-telling. We treat our fears as intelligence reports from the future rather than recognizing them as creative fiction generated in the present moment. The remarkable thing is how normalized this has become, how universally accepted it is that we should spend significant portions of our limited conscious existence worrying about versions of events that have not occurred and may never occur, treating these mental constructions with the same gravity we might reserve for actual experiences. Consider the moment when something unexpected happens in your day, perhaps a delay, a cancellation, or an interruption to your plans, and notice how quickly your mind assigns it a label of badness, a judgment that this thing is negative and unwelcome and something to be resisted rather than simply observed. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius understood that this labeling process is not an automatic response to external events, but rather a choice we make in the privacy of our own consciousness, and that when we examine this choice closely, we discover that nothing in the external world carries an inherent moral quality or valence that forces our judgment upon it. A delay in traffic, for instance, is simply the slower movement of vehicles through space and time, a neutral fact of physics and circumstance, yet we layer upon it our judgment of badness, our frustration, our sense that this is somehow wrong or unfair, and this judgment creates suffering where none need exist. The mechanism at work here is that our minds have been trained through years of conditioning to categorize experiences immediately into boxes labeled good and bad, useful and useless, desirable and undesirable. and we perform this categorization so automatically that we rarely pause to question whether these judgments are accurate or whether they serve our well-being. We have normalized this constant stream of judgment as though it were a necessary and inevitable part of consciousness itself, when in truth it is a habit, a learned behavior that we could choose to examine and modify at any moment. What the ancient Stoics recognized is that events themselves are neutral, and only our judgments about them create the emotional weight that we carry, so that by suspending judgment, by observing circumstances as they truly are without the filter of our preferences and fears, we free ourselves from the suffering that comes not from reality itself, but from our resistance to really. Consider the moment when you receive news that your flight has been delayed, or when someone fails to acknowledge your effort at work, or when you notice that a possession you valued has become worn and damaged by time. Your mind immediately contracts, your body tenses, and you feel the weight of disappointment settling into your chest. You find yourself trapped in an exhausting cycle of resistance against circumstances that lie entirely beyond your control, expending tremendous emotional energy in a futile attempt to reshape reality according to your preferences. The delay will not disappear because you resent it. The acknowledgement will not come because you feel you deserve it. The damage will not reverse because you wish it away. Yet we spend our days in this exact predicament, treating external events as though they possess the power to diminish our essential worth or compromise our peace of mind. The Stoic teaching that external things are fundamentally indifferent operates from a simple but profound recognition. What lies outside your will has no inherent moral quality, no inherent power to harm the part of you that matters most. Your health, your reputation, your possessions, the opinions of others, the outcomes of your endeavors, all of these exist in a realm that answers to fortune rather than to your inner character. This is not pessimism, but rather a clarifying reorientation of what deserves your attention and what does not. We have constructed entire civilizations around the pursuit and protection of externals, normalizing the anxiety that accompanies such futile effort, treating our distress as noble concern rather than recognizing it as the natural consequence of building our peace on unstable ground. As you settle into sleep tonight, notice how the mind releases its grip slightly when you consider that your value remains unchanged, whether circumstances align with your preference or contradict it entirely. Consider the moment when someone offers you criticism about your appearance, your work, or your choices, and notice what happens within you. There is an immediate contraction, a tightening in the chest, a rush of defensive thoughts, perhaps anger or shame rising unbidden. You replay the words in your mind, you imagine how others might now perceive you, you construct elaborate narratives about what this criticism means about your worth as a person. But pause here and examine what has actually occurred. The other person has merely shared their opinion, their subjective interpretation filtered through their own conditioning, biases, and limited perspective. They have offered their view of reality, not reality itself, yet you have accepted their opinion as truth and transformed it into suffering through the simple act of agreement and identification. The Stoics understood that opinions are not facts, and facts are not opinions, though we habitually blur this distinction until we can no longer see where one ends and the other begins. What creates the suffering is not the opinion itself, but your assent to it, your decision to believe it matters, to internalize it, to make it part of your narrative about who you are. An opinion has no power over you unless you grant it that power, yet we grant it constantly, automatically, without even noticing we have made a choice. We have normalized this process so thoroughly that we believe our suffering comes from the opinion itself rather than from our relationship to it. We walk through life as though opinions are facts written in stone, as though they are discoveries about us rather than projections from others. The liberation lies in recognizing that you need not accept any opinion as your truth, not because you are superior or right, but because an opinion is simply not the kind of thing that can be true or false about you in any ultimate sense. Consider the moment when someone cuts you off in traffic and immediately a cascade of thoughts floods your mind. This person is reckless, they are selfish, they do not care about anyone else on the road, they are a bad driver, perhaps even a bad person. Your body tightens, your heart rate increases, and you feel the heat of anger rising within you, all because of a split-second interpretation of another person's actions. The ancient Stoics understood that what disturbs us is not the event itself, but rather the judgment we layer upon that event, the meaning we assign to it, the story we construct around the bare facts of what occurred. The car changed lanes without signaling, that is the fact. Everything else is an addition, a fabrication of the mind seeking to make sense of the world through the lens of our own expectations and assumptions. When we remove the judgment and observe only what is actually happening, something remarkable occurs within the nervous system, a settling of the agitation that had no basis in reality itself. The judgment serves a function in our psychology. It gives us a sense of control and understanding. It allows us to place ourselves in a hierarchy of moral superiority, to feel that we are right and others are wrong, that our way of being is better than theirs. Yet this function comes at tremendous cost to our own peace and our own rest, because we are constantly scanning the world for evidence to support these judgments, constantly finding reasons to feel disturbed, constantly reinforcing the neural pathways that keep us in a state of reactive tension. We have normalized this pattern so thoroughly that we rarely recognize it as optional, as something we could simply choose to set aside, and so we carry these burdens into our bedtime, our minds still grinding through the day's accumulated grievances and interpretations. Consider the morning when you receive news that troubles you, perhaps a critical email from someone whose opinion matters to you, and notice how immediately your mind constructs a narrative around those words, layering them with meanings that may or may not have been intended, filtering them through your fears and past disappointments, until what began as a simple arrangement of sentences becomes a complex emotional event that occupies your entire consciousness and colors the hours that follow. The ancient Stoics understood something fundamental about this process that we often overlook in our modern lives. The meaning you assign to any external event is not discovered within that event itself, but rather constructed by your faculty of choice, your capacity to perceive and interpret. When Marcus Aurelius wrote about impressions, he was pointing to this precise mechanism, the moment between what happens and how you experience it, that infinitesimal space where you retain agency even when circumstances seem entirely beyond your control. Your neighbor's harsh tone could mean they are angry with you specifically, or they could be exhausted, distracted, or struggling with something completely unrelated to your presence. Yet your first instinct is often to select the interpretation that confirms your deepest insecurities, as if your mind has learned to seek out the most painful reading of any ambiguous situation. This pattern persists despite its obvious illogic, because perception feels automatic, immediate, almost involuntary, as though meaning simply emanates from events rather than being assigned to them by your own mind. And so we move through life treating our interpretations as facts, our stories as truths, rarely pausing to recognize that we have selected these meanings from among countless other possibilities. Consider the moment when you face a task that seems beyond your capacity, when the weight of continuation presses against your chest, and every fiber of your being wants to surrender to exhaustion or despair. You are sitting at your desk late into the evening, or perhaps you are standing in a difficult conversation that has stretched far longer than you anticipated, or you find yourself in the middle of a physical challenge that your body protests against with every aching muscle. The natural impulse is to stop, to give in, to allow circumstances to overwhelm you entirely. Yet something else emerges from within you, something quieter and more stubborn than the voice of fatigue or fear. This is the will to endure, the capacity to persist not because you believe the outcome is certain, but because you have chosen to remain present in the difficulty rather than abandon it. The Stoics understood that this will to endure is not a product of external circumstances or favorable conditions, but rather a faculty that exists within your control at every moment. When you choose to continue despite pain or uncertainty, you are not denying the reality of your suffering or pretending that the challenge is less formidable than it truly is. Instead, you are exercising the deepest part of your character, the part that decides whether difficulty will break you or deepen you. This endurance becomes the medium through which you discover what you are actually made of, revealing capacities you did not know existed within you. We have normalized the opposite impulse in much of modern life, surrounding ourselves with comfort and escape routes so complete that the very idea of enduring anything seems almost archaic or unnecessary. Yet beneath this cultural preference for ease runs a current of human experience that still requires persistence, still demands that we face seasons of difficulty without immediately fleeing. Consider the river that flows past your home, always moving, never the same water twice, yet we call it by the same name year after year, and we stand at its edge believing we understand its nature. This is the fundamental condition of existence that the ancient Stoics recognized with profound clarity. Nothing remains static, everything transitions from one state to another, and the very concept of permanence is an illusion we cling to because our minds seek stability in a universe that grants none. When you observe a single day, you notice how morning dissolves into afternoon, how your energy shifts, how your thoughts transform, how even your body renews itself at the cellular level without your conscious awareness. Yet we speak as though we are the same person we were yesterday, the same person we will be tomorrow. The mechanism behind this ceaseless flow operates at every level of reality, from the atoms composing your body to the civilizations rising and falling across history. And there exists a logic to this impermanence that cannot be escaped or negotiated with, because change is not a temporary condition that might someday reverse itself, but rather the fundamental nature of reality itself. We have normalized this flowing, passing quality of existence to such an extent that we forget to see it clearly, moving through our days as though they form a solid, unchanging landscape, when in fact we are riding waves of transformation that never cease, collecting possessions we believe will define us, maintaining relationships we think will anchor us, pursuing achievements we imagine will solidify our worth, all while every single element of our lives silently metamorphoses into something else. The Stoic meditation on this truth invites you to stop resisting the current and instead observe it with acceptance, to notice that your suffering often arises not from change itself, but from your insistence that things should remain as they are, and consider the house you occupy, the one you call yours, the structure you have paid for with years of labor and sacrifice, the walls within which you have built your life and raised your family and stored your most precious memories. You speak of it as your possession, you defend it as your property, you worry constantly about its maintenance and its value and the taxes you must pay to keep it. And yet the moment you cease to exist, it will pass to someone else entirely, and within a generation or two, your name will be forgotten in relation to it. And eventually another family will live there and call it theirs with the exact same conviction you feel now. The same pattern holds true for every object you have ever accumulated, every piece of clothing you wear, every device you touch, every book you read, every coin you possess. You are merely a temporary custodian, a brief caretaker in an endless succession of caretakers, and this is not a pessimistic observation, but rather a simple fact of existence that remains obscured by the language we use and the narratives we construct around ownership. The psychological mechanism that creates this illusion of possession is remarkably efficient. Our minds evolved to create a sense of stable identity by associating ourselves with external objects, to mark territory, and to distinguish ourselves from others through the accumulation of things, and this served an important function in our ancestral environment. Yet in our modern world, this same mechanism persists in a vastly amplified form, encouraged by commerce and advertising and social convention, until we find ourselves believing with genuine conviction that objects can belong to us in some fundamental way, despite the obvious evidence of impermanence that surrounds us. Consider the way you move through your day, the habits you have formed, the very structure of how you organize your time and thoughts, and notice how much of it has been borrowed directly from the natural world without your conscious awareness or permission. The cycles of waking and sleeping that govern your energy levels mirror the rotation of the earth itself, yet you often fight against this ancient rhythm as though you alone possess the power to override what billions of years of evolution have established. Your body temperature rises and falls in patterns synchronized with the sun, your hunger emerges and recedes like tides responding to invisible forces, your attention spans contract and expand much like the breathing of some great living creature. Stoic philosophers understood something profound about this borrowed nature that we have largely forgotten in our modern age. Everything you experience, every sensation and emotion and thought, has been lent to you temporarily from the vast natural world, and one day it will be reclaimed. Your muscles were borrowed from the elements, your consciousness from patterns established long before your birth, your very capacity to reason from the same source that organizes the migration of birds and the growth of forests. We have normalized the illusion of ownership over these borrowed things, speaking as though our bodies and our minds belong entirely to us, as though we have created them through some act of personal will or deserving. This persistent delusion generates tremendous suffering because it makes us cling desperately to what was never meant to be held permanently, what was always meant to flow through us and move onward to other forms and other beings. When you truly accept that you are merely a temporary custodian of borrowed gifts, the anxiety surrounding loss begins to dissolve naturally, and what remains is gratitude for the precise duration of the loan. Consider the moment when a friend hands you something with the understanding that it will come back to them, whether it is a book they have mentioned wanting to discuss with you, a tool you need for a single afternoon project, or money lent during a time of temporary shortage. The transaction is simple in its mechanics yet profound in its implications for how we understand trust and our relationship to the material world and to one another. You accept the object with an implicit agreement that exists not merely in words, but in the unspoken compact between two people who have decided to extend themselves toward each other. Yet observe how often this simple agreement becomes complicated by the passage of time, by the subtle way we begin to think of the borrowed thing as somehow belonging more to us than to its original owner, by how easily we can convince ourselves that the other person has forgotten or no longer needs what they have entrusted to our care. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a gradual shift in our sense of possession and responsibility, where the borrowed item slowly transforms in our minds from something held in trust to something held in right. We begin to tell ourselves small stories about why return might be delayed or why the other person surely understands our continued need. This erosion of intention happens not through dramatic moral failure, but through the quiet accumulation of small rationalizations and postponements. Yet it is remarkable that despite understanding intellectually that trust once broken becomes difficult to repair, despite knowing the shame that follows the discovery that we have not returned what was given to us, we continue to allow these patterns to persist in our lives and relationships. Consider the painter who spends decades perfecting their craft, layering colors and textures across countless canvases, each one a fragment of an evolving vision that will never be fully realized within their lifetime. Consider the musician who composes symphonies, knowing that the final movement may never sound exactly as imagined, or the architect whose greatest building will stand long after they have ceased to walk its halls. We move through existence as though we are creating something perpetually unfinished, perpetually in progress, always believing that the next decade will bring clarity or completion or the answer we have been searching for. Yet the Stoic philosophers understood something that modern culture desperately tries to deny. Death is not the interruption of life, but rather its completion, the frame that gives the painting its meaning and boundaries. Without an ending, there is no coherence, no narrative arc, no sense of proportion or purpose. A life that continues infinitely loses all structure and urgency. Everything becomes equally important and equally trivial when stretched across eternity. The finitude of our existence is precisely what makes our choices matter, what transforms our days from an endless, undifferentiated stream into a meaningful sequence of moments. When we accept that death will complete our life, we stop waiting for someday and we begin to recognize that every action we take, every word we speak, every relationship we nurture is now, in this moment, a decisive stroke upon the canvas we are painting. We have normalized the denial of this truth through distraction and pharmaceutical intervention and the fantasy of indefinite extension. Yet the ancient wisdom persists in our bones. We are not incomplete beings reaching toward impossible perfection, but whole beings moving toward an inevitable conclusion that gives our whole being its shape and significance. Consider the person who sits in their office, watching the clock tick forward through another day, feeling the weight of tasks left undone and hours already spent, yet proceeding as though there exists an infinite reservoir of tomorrows from which they might draw. This person checks their phone, scrolls through endless content, postpones the meaningful conversation, delays the project that matters, all while the hours dissolve into nothing, and somehow we have collectively agreed to live this way without acknowledging the fundamental absurdity of it. The Stoic philosopher understood something that modern psychology has only recently begun to validate, that our denial of time's scarcity is not a character flaw, but rather a psychological necessity that we've learned to mistake for normalcy. We know at the intellectual level that our days are numbered and finite, that the hour spent in distraction is an hour removed from our lives and can never be recovered, and yet we live as though we possess an exception to this rule, as though the warning applies to everyone else but not to us. This strange persistence of denial despite overwhelming evidence occurs because accepting true scarcity would force us to make choices, to prioritize, to surrender certain possibilities in favor of others, and the mind rebels against such limitation. We normalize this contradiction by surrounding ourselves with others who operate identically, by constructing entire cultures around the avoidance of mortality's implications, by filling our days so completely with distraction that we never have to sit quietly with the truth that time marches forward regardless of our attention. When you lie here in the darkness, however, and your body settles into rest, you might allow this truth to surface without resistance. Every moment you are not living is a moment you are spending, and the only question that matters is whether you are spending it consciously or simply allowing it to. Consider the ordinary morning when you reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor, scrolling through notifications that demand nothing from you while your mind is still soft and unguarded, capable of clarity and intention. You tell yourself you will check for just one moment, yet 15 minutes dissolve into the space between sleep and wakefulness, and the day has already begun without your conscious participation. The psychological mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. We have normalized the fracturing of our attention into such small pieces that we no longer recognize the accumulated loss. Each moment borrowed feels insignificant in isolation, a mere second or two here, a few minutes there, and yet these fragments compound into hours, days, and ultimately years spent half present in our own existence. We have become comfortable with this division of ourselves because the cost is distributed so evenly across time that we do not see the wound as a whole. The Stoics understood that time is the one resource that cannot be replenished or recovered, that each moment is an irreplaceable unit of your life, and yet we treat our hours as though they are infinite. We scroll, we distract, we defer the meaningful conversation, the difficult work, the quiet reflection, telling ourselves that we will return to these things when we have more time, when the moment is right, when the conditions are perfect. But the conditions will never be perfect, and more time never arrives, because time only moves forward, and what is wasted now is gone forever. There exists a peculiar contradiction in how we value our moments. We would never give a friend's gift to a stranger, yet we surrender hours of our consciousness to the trivial and the empty with barely a hesitation. Consider the way you move through your morning routine, the mechanical progression of tasks that comprise your waking hours, the assumption that tomorrow will arrive as it always has, that there will be time enough to complete what remains unfinished today, that the conversations left unsaid can be spoken tomorrow, that the letters unwritten can be written next week, that the person you meant to call will still be available when you finally decide to reach out. We construct our lives upon an invisible foundation of postponement, a quiet agreement with ourselves that the future stretches endlessly before us, an infinite corridor of tomorrows, into which we can perpetually defer the things that matter most. The Stoic practice of imagining each day as though it were your last operates not as morbid pessimism, but as a psychological realignment, a deliberate reorientation of what constitutes importance and urgency. When you approach your morning with the assumption that this may be the final sunrise you witness, the trivial grievances that typically consume your mental energy suddenly lose their gravitational pull. The argument with a colleague, the critical comment from a stranger, the minor embarrassment from yesterday begins to dissolve into insignificance. This mechanism works because it forces you to distinguish between what you genuinely value and what you have merely inherited as a source of concern, between the relationships that nourish your spirit and the obligations that drain it. Yet despite possessing this knowledge, despite understanding intellectually that our time is finite and our presence temporary, we continue to live as though we possess unlimited reserves of days, as though the person we love will always be available for a deeper conversation, as though we can always return to the things that matter later. Consider the person who spends their days in quiet desperation, postponing the things that matter most, telling themselves that someday, when circumstances align, when enough money accumulates, when the children grow older, when retirement arrives, they will finally begin to live the life they have always imagined. They work jobs that drain their spirit, maintain relationships that feel hollow, and ignore the small moments of beauty and connection that pass before them daily, all under the assumption that there is an infinite reserve of tomorrows waiting to be claimed. They move through their life as though they are rehearsing for something that will begin later, as though the present moment is merely a waiting room before the actual performance starts. The Stoics understood something profound about this pattern. To live as if dying is to recognize that this assumption of endless time is a fiction, and that this fiction has shaped how we allocate our attention and our days. When you truly accept that your existence will end, that the number of your mornings is fixed and unknown, the priorities that seemed so pressing begin to shift and reorganize themselves without effort. The petty grievances that occupied your thoughts lose their weight, the comparisons you make with others feel suddenly absurd, and the things you have been avoiding because they felt too difficult or too vulnerable suddenly seem like the only things worth doing. This is not morbidity or pessimism, but rather a clarification of vision, a burning away of the false urgencies that normally cloud our judgment. What persists despite knowing this truth intellectually is our stubborn behavior of living as though death is something that happens to other people, to those far older or far sicker, to everyone except ourselves in this present moment. Consider the moment when you embrace someone you love, knowing with absolute certainty that this will be the final time you ever see them alive. Perhaps it is an aging parent departing on a journey from which they will not return, or a dear friend relocating to a distant land, or a relative whose health has visibly declined to the point where the mathematics of mortality becomes undeniable. In that moment, your mind performs a peculiar calculation, weighing the infinite value of this final interaction against all the previous encounters that seemed infinite at the time but were not. You hold them perhaps a moment longer, you study their face with unusual intensity, you memorize details you took for granted before, and you feel a sharp clarity that most moments of your life lack entirely. This clarity arrives not from any mystical source, but from the sudden, forced acknowledgement that time is not renewable, that presence cannot be deferred, that every moment with another person carries a weight we normally pretend does not exist. The Stoics understood this mechanism well, recognizing that we spend our lives treating nearly every interaction as though infinite repetitions lay ahead, when in fact we are always living through someone's final time with us, someone's last opportunity to speak or listen or simply be present together. We normalize this blindness despite possessing complete logical knowledge of human mortality, despite understanding intellectually that every meeting could be final, despite the countless reminders history and experience provide. Yet we move through most days as though we have endless tomorrows with the people who matter to us, squandering irreplaceable moments on distraction and postponement and the comfortable assumption that another chance will come. Consider the moment when you hold something precious in your hands, whether it is a photograph of a loved one, a letter written in an earlier time, or perhaps a possession that has belonged to your family for generations, and notice how even in that moment of holding it, you are aware on some level that it will not remain with you forever, that the paper will yellow, the ink will fade, the object will deteriorate, and eventually it will be lost or destroyed or simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. This awareness exists alongside our tendency to treat these things as though they are permanent fixtures in our lives, as though we can rely upon them to be present whenever we choose to return to them, as though their continued existence is somehow guaranteed by the force of our attachment to them or our belief in their importance. The mechanism underlying this strange contradiction in how we approach impermanent things is rooted in how our minds process time and change. We live primarily in the present moment, and the present moment feels stable and unchanging, even though we intellectually understand that every moment is transitioning into the next, that nothing we perceive is truly static, that the very cells of our bodies are constantly being replaced and renewed. We have normalized this gap between knowledge and behavior so thoroughly that we barely notice it exists, moving through our days as though the things we love and the people we cherish and the circumstances we depend upon will naturally extend indefinitely into the future. Building plans and expectations around permanence when all of our actual experience, if we paid careful attention, would show us nothing but flux and change and the dissolution of every formed thing. The Stoics understood that meditation upon this impermanence was not a cause for despair, but rather an invitation to clarity, that recognizing the temporary nature of all things actually frees us from the burden. Consider the river that flows past the same bank every single day, and yet no person who stands at that bank ever encounters the same water twice, for the current moves perpetually forward, carrying with it everything that enters its path, transforming the landscape grain by grain over years and centuries, until the very geography itself becomes unrecognizable from what it once was. This ancient observation, made by philosophers long before modern science confirmed it, reflects a truth so fundamental to existence that we might think humanity would have organized itself entirely around this reality. And yet we spend most of our lives resisting it, denying it, or pretending that permanence is somehow achievable if we simply work hard enough or plan carefully enough. The mechanism underlying this resistance is quite simple and deeply rooted in how our minds function. For our brains evolved to recognize patterns and create a sense of stability from those patterns, allowing us to navigate the world with some degree of confidence and predictability. Yet this same mechanism that once kept our ancestors safe now becomes a source of profound suffering when we cling to the illusion that the patterns we observe today will somehow remain constant tomorrow. We watch our bodies change with the passage of time. We see our relationships transform in ways we never anticipated. We observe our circumstances shift as though moved by invisible hands. And yet we are somehow shocked and disturbed by each transition, treating change as an aberration rather than recognizing it as the fundamental law governing all existence. The Stoics understood this deeply, teaching that acceptance of change is not resignation, but rather liberation. For when we stop fighting against the nature of reality itself, and instead align our expectations with what actually is, we free ourselves from the exhausting burden of denial and resistance that characterizes so much of human anxiety. And consider the person who wakes each morning and begins their day by checking their appearance in the mirror, arranging their clothes with care, ensuring their hair is properly styled, and selecting accessories that convey a particular image to the world. This individual is not vain in any moral sense, nor are they consumed by vanity, yet they have organized their morning around these preferences for health, cleanliness, and modest presentation. The Stoics called these things preferred indifferents, understanding that while external things like our appearance, our possessions, our social status, and our physical health are ultimately beyond our complete control and therefore not truly good or evil in themselves, we may reasonably prefer certain conditions over others. The mechanism here is subtle but profound. The Stoic sage recognizes that virtue alone is the only true good, that moral character is the only thing wholly within our control, yet simultaneously acknowledges that it is entirely rational to prefer health to sickness, wealth to poverty, and good reputation to disgrace, provided that our pursuit of these things does not compromise our virtue or our principles. We have somehow normalized the idea that preference itself is dangerous, that wanting anything at all beyond moral perfection is a form of weakness or attachment that will inevitably cause us suffering. Yet the Stoic position is far more nuanced and psychologically sophisticated. We may work diligently toward health, toward financial security, toward maintaining good relationships, toward developing our talents and abilities, without ever believing that our happiness or our worth depends upon achieving these external outcomes. The preferred indifferent is the middle way between reckless indulgence and punitive self-denial, between the person who believes their value rises and falls with their circumstances and the person who pretends that circumstances matter not at all. Consider the person who has achieved tremendous external success, who possesses wealth beyond measure, who commands respect through position and authority, yet who finds themselves empty in the quiet moments of reflection, plagued by anxiety about maintaining their status, tormented by the compromises they have made to reach these heights, unable to sleep soundly because they know their accomplishments rest upon a foundation of moral shortcuts and ethical flexibility rather than genuine integrity. They have secured everything the world claims to value, and yet they are miserable, while elsewhere there exists a person of modest means who has lived with unwavering honesty, who has chosen the difficult path of principle over the easy path of profit, who faces each day with a clear conscience and genuine self-respect, and they sleep peacefully despite having none of the external markers of success. The mechanism operating here is fundamental to human psychology. External goods are inherently unstable, subject to fortune, circumstance, loss, and the judgments of others, while virtue stands alone as the only possession that cannot be taken from you, cannot be diminished by circumstance, cannot be corrupted by the world's indifference, because it exists entirely within your own capacity to choose and maintain. Yet we have become so normalized to the opposite belief that we barely notice how absurd it is, how we spend our entire lives chasing fragile things while neglecting the one thing that truly sustains happiness, how we teach our children that success means accumulation rather than character, how we measure human worth by external markers rather than by the integrity of their choices, how we have inverted the ancient wisdom and made ourselves slaves to things that were never meant to be masters of our peace. Consider the person who has lost their wealth, their status, their health, and even their freedom, yet remains inwardly peaceful because they have not compromised their principles or acted with dishonor. Now consider another person who possesses great riches, perfect health, high social standing, and complete liberty, yet lives in constant torment because they have achieved these things through deception, cruelty, or betrayal of their deepest values. The ancient Stoics understood something profound in observing these two lives, that virtue and vice alone determine the quality of human existence, not the external circumstances that surround us. Vice, which we might understand as the misalignment between our actions and our highest principles, as the choice to act with ignorance or malice or cowardice when we know better, represents the only true evil in the human experience. This is not a matter of social judgment or religious prohibition, but rather a logical observation about how the human mind actually functions when it operates in conflict with itself. When you act viciously, you create an internal discord that no external reward can resolve. Your mind knows what it has done. Your conscience, that quiet voice which reflects your deepest understanding of right action, cannot be silenced by possessions or pleasures. The mechanism is simple. Vice corrupts your judgment, fragments your sense of self, and creates anxiety that permeates every moment because you become unreliable to yourself. Yet we have normalized the pursuit of external goods as though they could serve as substitutes for virtue, as though we might trade our integrity for comfort and somehow come out ahead. We watch people sacrifice their principles for advancement, compromise their honesty for gain, and abandon their loved ones for ambition. And we treat this as normal human behavior rather than as a profound mistake in reasoning. Consider the person who possesses great technical knowledge yet uses it to deceive others for personal gain, the one who understands the mechanisms of manipulation and applies them without hesitation, the scholar who can articulate brilliant theories but lives in contradiction to every principle they teach. And you begin to recognize a fundamental truth that the ancient Stoics understood with absolute clarity. Wisdom divorced from virtue is not wisdom at all, but merely a dangerous tool in the hands of someone spiritually incomplete. The mechanism underlying this insight operates on a simple principle that our modern world has somehow managed to obscure: that true understanding of reality, genuine comprehension of how the universe actually functions and how human beings ought to live within it, naturally produces right action as its inevitable consequence, because to truly know what is good is to be drawn toward it. And to understand the nature of human flourishing is to orient your life toward it without internal conflict or resistance. When we separate knowledge from virtue, when we celebrate the brilliant mind that serves only selfish ambitions, when we admire the clever strategist who manipulates without conscience, we have actually abandoned wisdom entirely and replaced it with mere cunning, a hollow imitation that resembles knowledge from the outside but lacks the spiritual foundation that makes it authentic. Yet we have normalized this separation so thoroughly in contemporary society that we scarcely notice the profound oddity of it. We celebrate intellectual achievement without any corresponding demand for moral achievement. We promote people to positions of influence based on their technical expertise, while remaining indifferent to whether they possess any wisdom about how to use that expertise ethically. And we have created entire systems where knowledge accumulates without virtue developing in parallel, producing generations of people. Consider the person who stands alone against the tide of popular opinion, who speaks an unpopular truth in a room full of people who desperately wish to hear something else, who persists in doing what they believe to be right despite knowing that ridicule, rejection, or social exclusion may follow as a consequence. This is not the dramatic courage of the soldier charging into battle, though that too has its place in the hierarchy of human virtues, but rather the quieter, more persistent courage that defines the texture of an ordinary life lived with integrity. The mechanism underlying this virtue is deceptively simple. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the alignment of action with principle despite the presence of that fear, a choice to move forward when every instinct whispers retreat. When we understand courage in this way, we recognize that it is not some rare and exotic quality reserved for the exceptional few, but rather a fundamental capacity that lives within each person, waiting to be exercised and strengthened through repetition and practice. Yet we have somehow normalized the expectation that courage should be unnecessary, that we ought to live in a world where doing the right thing carries no cost whatsoever, where virtue requires no sacrifice, and where integrity demands no payment. We have constructed elaborate narratives in which the courageous person is somehow foolish or naive, sacrificing their comfort for causes that do not matter, when in truth the courageous person understands something essential: that certain things matter more than comfort, more than approval, more than the pleasant numbness that comes from simply following the crowd. As you rest now, allow yourself to understand that courage is not something you must conjure from nowhere, but something you must simply decide to practice, again and again, in the small moments of your daily life, and in doing so, you align yourself with virtue itself. Consider the moment when you witness an injustice in your daily life, perhaps a colleague taking credit for another's work, or a person of privilege avoiding consequences that would bind someone less fortunate. And notice how your body responds with a sharp and genuine discomfort that feels almost physical in nature. This reaction reveals something fundamental about human consciousness that the ancient Stoics understood with remarkable clarity. Justice is not merely a social convention or a practical arrangement we've agreed upon for convenience, but rather it is virtue itself, which means it is inseparable from living well and becoming the person you are capable of becoming. When you act unjustly toward another, you are not simply committing a transgression against an external rule or risking external punishment, but you are actively harming your own character, corrupting the very essence of who you are becoming through each choice and action. The mechanism at work here is subtle yet profound because it operates at the level of your consciousness and coherence as a person. Injustice fractures your integrity, creates internal contradiction between your values and your behavior, and prevents you from achieving that harmony and alignment with reason that constitutes true flourishing. Yet in our modern world, we have somehow normalized a peculiar compartmentalization where people convince themselves they can be unjust in specific domains while remaining virtuous overall, as though character could be divided into separate chambers rather than existing as an integrated whole that either coheres or falls apart. We live surrounded by justifications for small cruelties, minor dishonesties, and selective compassion, rationalizing that survival or advantage sometimes requires us to compromise our principles, when in fact the Stoics would argue that this compromise is the only true threat to our survival as integrated human beings. Consider the modern person sitting alone in their home on an ordinary evening, surrounded by the fruits of abundance that previous generations could scarcely have imagined, yet feeling a peculiar emptiness that no amount of consumption seems to satisfy. They scroll through endless streams of content, each notification triggering a small burst of dopamine, each purchase promising fulfillment that arrives briefly and then evaporates into the background noise of their daily existence. The refrigerator contains more food than necessary, the closet overflows with unworn clothing, the entertainment options are literally infinite, and yet there persists a nagging sense that something essential remains out of reach, a hunger that grows more insistent the more aggressively it is fed. This is the paradox of our age, where the inability to restrain ourselves from excess has become so normalized that we have nearly forgotten that temperance was ever considered a virtue at all. The Stoic philosophers understood something fundamental about human nature that we have largely forgotten in our rush toward maximization and optimization of pleasure. That restraint is not a punishment inflicted upon us by puritanical forces, but rather the very foundation upon which genuine tranquility and virtue must be built. When we exercise temperance, we are not denying ourselves happiness through some grim exercise of willpower, but rather we are establishing our own agency and freedom from the tyranny of unbridled desire. The person who can sit at a feast and eat with moderation experiences a dignity and peace that the glutton never knows, not because of the food itself, but because they have maintained sovereignty over their own appetites and choices. This principle extends far beyond physical nourishment into every realm of human experience. The temperate consumption of wine, the moderate pursuit of wealth, the measured engagement with entertainment, the restrained end. Consider the modern person who wakes before dawn to sit in artificial light, who spends the daylight hours in climate-controlled rooms staring at screens, who eats foods engineered in laboratories and processed beyond recognition, who moves his body only when forced by schedule or guilt, who communicates through glowing rectangles rather than presence, and who fills every silence with noise and distraction until sleep becomes elusive and difficult. This person is living in profound violation of the nature that shaped his entire being across millions of years of evolution, and yet he accepts this arrangement as simply the cost of contemporary existence, rarely questioning whether this dissonance between his biological design and his daily life might be the source of his restlessness, his anxiety, his inability to find peace. The mechanism at work here is subtle but powerful. Human beings are creatures adapted for rhythms of sunlight and darkness, for movement across variable terrain, for whole foods and real relationships, for periods of both exertion and genuine rest. Yet the modern world has systematically inverted nearly every condition that our nature requires, and we have normalized this inversion so thoroughly that we believe the resulting dissatisfaction is simply the inherent burden of being alive in this era. The Stoics understood that living according to nature was not a romantic ideal, but a practical necessity, a recognition that we are part of a rational order, subject to laws as immutable as gravity, and that resistance to these laws produces suffering not from malice, but from simple violation of our own design. What persists is our collective belief that we can engineer our way out of nature, that we can override the biological and psychological needs written into our very cells through sheer force of will and modern convenience, that somehow we have transcended the requirements that govern all other living things, and this to consider the moment when you observe the natural world in its most ordinary expressions. The way light travels in straight lines until it meets resistance, the way water always flows downward toward the lowest point, the way seasons return in their appointed order year after year without variation or hesitation. These are not accidents or the whimsical choices of capricious forces, but rather the manifestations of rational principles that operate with absolute consistency throughout the universe. The ancient Stoics understood that beneath the surface of all apparent chaos and confusion lies a fundamental logos, a rational order that governs not only the movements of celestial bodies, but also the smallest details of existence on this earth. This principle of universal reason does not announce itself through dramatic gestures. Instead, it reveals itself through patient observation of patterns that repeat, through laws that hold true whether we believe in them or not, through the reliable operation of cause and effect across all domains of reality. Yet human beings, possessed of rational minds themselves, frequently find themselves struggling against this very order, acting as though the universe operates according to their personal preferences rather than according to the rational laws that have structured existence since the beginning of time. We live as though exceptions should be made for our circumstances, as though our suffering represents a deviation from the way things should be rather than a natural consequence of the rational laws we inhabit. The Stoic perspective invites us to recognize that by accepting the rational governance of the cosmos, by understanding that order and reason pervade all things, we align ourselves with the deepest truths of existence and free ourselves from the exhausting resistance to reality that characterizes so much human anguish and confusion. Consider the moment you wake in the morning and notice that the sunlight streaming through your window follows the same geometric patterns it followed yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that, stretching back through centuries of human observation into the deep past, when our ancestors first began to recognize that the universe operated according to consistent principles rather than the whims of chaos. The Stoics understood this consistency as logos, the rational principle that underlies all existence, the invisible architecture that governs not only the movement of celestial bodies, but also the unfolding of events in your own life, the way that cause necessarily precedes effect, the way that your thoughts produce predictable emotional consequences, the way that injustice inevitably contains within itself the seeds of its own undoing. This logos is not something distant or abstract, reserved only for philosophers or scientists in their laboratories, but rather it is woven through the fabric of every moment you experience, evident in the way that water always flows downward, in the way that plants turn toward light, in the way that your heart responds to fear before your mind has consciously registered danger. When you lie in your bed now, allowing your body to settle into rest, you might recognize that the very tiredness you feel follows logos, the logical consequence of a day spent in activity, the body's rational need for restoration that no amount of mental resistance can override. Yet we spend so much of our waking lives fighting against this logos, denying its existence, insisting that reality should conform to our desires rather than accepting that we ourselves are part of this rational order, subject to the same principles that govern everything else in existence. And this resistance creates suffering that serves no purpose other than to distance us from peace. Consider the moment when you find yourself in disagreement with another person, perhaps a colleague, a family member, or a stranger whose views seem fundamentally opposed to your own, and notice how quickly the mind constructs barriers between what you believe to be rational and what you perceive as their irrationality. The Stoic philosophers understood that beneath the surface of human conflict lies a deeper current, a universal principle of reason that flows through all conscious beings, connecting them in ways that ordinary perception fails to recognize. When Marcus Aurelius wrote of the logos, the rational principle that governs the cosmos, he was pointing toward something that transcends individual opinion or cultural conditioning, a fundamental intelligence that underlies not only your own thoughts, but also the thoughts of those with whom you disagree most vehemently. The mechanism at work here involves understanding that reason itself is not a private possession, something you own uniquely while others lack it or possess inferior versions, but rather a universal inheritance shared equally by all human minds, distorted sometimes by circumstance, education, fear, or desire, yet never absent entirely from any human consciousness. What persists despite its lack of logical foundation is the ego's insistence on separation, the habitual belief that your reasoning stands apart from and above the reasoning of others, creating an illusion of fundamental division where only superficial difference truly exists. We have normalized this separation so thoroughly that we rarely pause to consider that when you recognize truth, when you feel the clarity of genuine insight, you are not discovering something private to yourself, but tapping into something universal, something available to everyone if they could clear away their own obstacles and obstinacy. Consider the moment when you find yourself caught in a spiral of worry, perhaps lying awake at night, your mind cycling through scenarios that have not yet occurred and may never occur at all, your body tense despite the safety of your surroundings, your breath shallow despite the abundance of air available to you. In this state, you are physically safe, materially secure, and yet your inner experience is one of profound disturbance, as though you are under genuine threat. The Stoics would recognize in this moment a fundamental disconnect between what is actually true and what your mind has constructed as true. A gap between your rational faculty and the narratives your imagination has spun without your deliberate consent. Your rational soul, that capacity for clear judgment and logical assessment that distinguishes human consciousness, remains available to you even in this moment of turbulence, yet it has been temporarily eclipsed by a pattern of thinking that serves no protective function and solves no actual problem. This mechanism persists because anxiety hijacks the very faculty meant to protect you from genuine danger, creating a feedback loop where worry feels productive, where mental rehearsal feels like preparation, where spiraling thoughts feel like problem-solving when in fact they represent a capitulation of your rational mind to patterns of fear. We have normalized this state to such a degree that we speak of it as inevitable, as though the thinking mind were not actually in our control, as though the rational soul within us had no authority over the direction of our thoughts. Yet the Stoics understood that beneath all circumstances, regardless of external events, you retain the capacity to observe your own thinking, to question whether your thoughts align with reality, and to redirect your attention toward what is genuinely within your power to influence. Imagine yourself sitting in a crowded room where everyone around you seems composed, confident, and certain of their place in the world, while you feel exposed and vulnerable to their judgment, and you begin to construct elaborate mental walls to protect yourself from their gaze, rehearsing conversations before they happen, imagining criticisms that have not been voiced, and withdrawing your authentic self behind a carefully curated facade that you maintain with exhausting vigilance throughout each day. This defensive architecture, which the ancient Stoics called the inner citadel, represents the fortress we build within our own minds, the protected space where we retreat from external threats and from the unpredictable nature of other people's opinions and actions. The mechanism underlying this construction is fundamentally sound in its logic. If we can control what others see of us, we believe we can control their judgments, and if we control their judgments, we can protect ourselves from rejection and harm. Our nervous system recognizes danger in social exposure and activates these protective strategies as a reasonable response to genuine vulnerability, for we are indeed social creatures whose survival historically depended upon acceptance within our group. Yet what began as a functional defense mechanism has become something far more comprehensive and restrictive in modern life, as we have constructed such elaborate and permanent fortifications around our inner citadel that we have forgotten how to lower the drawbridge, forgotten what it feels like to be seen without armor, and normalized the exhausting experience of maintaining these defensive walls every single moment we spend around other people. The Stoics understood that this inner citadel could be reoriented toward something far more powerful than mere self-protection. It could become a fortress of wisdom, a retreat into truth and virtue that needed no defense because it was built on Somme. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet room and suddenly an unwanted thought arrives, a worry about something you said years ago, a fear about the future, a criticism you heard in passing. Your first instinct is to fight it, to push it away, to erect walls against it as though your mind were a fortress under siege. You tense your shoulders, clench your jaw, and mentally declare that you will not allow this thought to exist, that you will banish it through sheer force of will. Yet the more forcefully you resist, the more vividly the thought returns, cycling endlessly through your consciousness like an unwelcome visitor who refuses to leave no matter how firmly you close the door. This is the paradox of the defended mind, and it operates through a mechanism both simple and profound. When we treat our thoughts as enemies to be conquered rather than as neutral events to be observed, we create resistance, and resistance generates friction, and friction generates the very distress we are attempting to escape. The mind, unlike a physical fortress, cannot be fortified against its own contents through force or determination. Instead, the thought gains power precisely from our struggle against it, from the energy we invest in its rejection, from the narrative we construct around how wrong it is for that thought to exist within us. We have normalized this defensive posture so completely that we rarely question it, rarely notice that we are spending our mental resources in an exhausting battle against our own consciousness, rather than simply allowing thoughts to arise and pass like clouds moving through an open sky. The Stoic understanding recognizes that a truly strong mind is not one that successfully repels unwanted thoughts through fortification, but rather one that remains unmoved by their presence, that observes them with quiet curiosity, and allows them to exist without judgment or resistance. Consider the moment when you make a promise to yourself or another person, when you commit to a course of action with genuine intention and apparent finality. Yet somewhere in the depths of your mind, you have already begun constructing an escape route, a hidden clause that permits you to withdraw or reverse your commitment should circumstances change or your motivation falter. This is the reserve clause, the unspoken asterisk that accompanies nearly every decision we make in modern life, and it operates so subtly that we rarely acknowledge its presence even as it governs our behavior and shapes our commitments. We tell ourselves we will exercise regularly, yet we mentally reserve the right to stop whenever we grow tired or busy. We declare our dedication to a project or relationship, yet we maintain an internal escape hatch that allows us to depart if things become difficult or less rewarding than anticipated. The psychological mechanism behind this reservation is fundamentally rooted in our desire to maintain control and protect ourselves from the consequences of our own choices. By refusing to fully commit, by always keeping one foot out the door, we attempt to insulate ourselves from disappointment and failure, believing that if we never truly surrender to a promise, we can never truly fail at keeping it. Yet this philosophy is paradoxical because the reserve clause actually undermines the very thing it claims to protect. Our lack of wholehearted commitment becomes self-fulfilling, as half measures produce half results, and our mental escape routes become actual roads we eventually travel down. The Stoics understood that this psychological hedge against suffering is itself a form of suffering, that the divided mind cannot achieve its aims, and that true freedom comes not from maintaining options, but from surrendering completely to the path we have chosen, from removing the reserve clause and committing with our whole being to what we ha. Consider the person who finds themselves at a crossroads in life, facing a decision between two seemingly different paths, each appearing to lead toward opposite destinations, yet who later discovers that both routes somehow converged toward the same meaningful outcome they were always meant to reach. This experience reveals something profound about the nature of intention and inevitability working together rather than against one another. The Stoic insight that fate guides the willing suggests that when we align our will with what is actually happening around us, we discover that resistance was never necessary and that the universe was moving us toward certain destinations all along. The psychological mechanism operates through a subtle shift in perception. When we stop fighting against circumstances and instead ask ourselves what we can do within them, we suddenly notice opportunities and connections we could not see before when we were consumed by struggle and denial. This is not mystical thinking, but rather the natural result of how human attention works. We find what we are looking for, and when we stop looking for escape routes, we begin noticing the pathways that were always available to us. What persists in modern life is our tendency to experience this same phenomenon, yet attribute it to luck or coincidence rather than recognizing it as the natural consequence of aligned intention. We have normalized the experience of fighting against our circumstances, of treating fate as an enemy to be overcome, when in truth the most graceful path forward has always been to accept what is unfolding while directing our effort toward excellence within that unfolding. The willing person discovers what the resistant person never will, that surrender and determination are not opposites but partners in creating a life of purpose. Consider the person who has decided, with absolute clarity, that they must change some fundamental aspect of their life, yet finds themselves each morning returning to the very patterns they have resolved to abandon, as though an invisible force pulls them backward into familiarity despite their conscious declarations otherwise. This is the paradox of resistance that the Stoics understood deeply. Fate, or what we might call necessity, drags the unwilling forward regardless of their protests, yet simultaneously, the unwilling person drags themselves backward through their own resistance to what must come. The mechanism at work here involves a peculiar psychology where the mind creates an imaginary separation between the self that wants change and the self that fears it, between the rational decision made in a moment of clarity and the emotional attachment to comfort that emerges when change becomes imminent. We resist not because the new path is genuinely worse, but because resistance itself becomes a form of control, an illusion of agency when facing the genuine powerlessness of circumstance. The person who procrastinates on necessary transformation, who hesitates at the threshold of growth, who clings to suffering because at least it is known, is being dragged forward by life itself while simultaneously dragging their feet backward, creating an exhausting tension that could be entirely dissolved through simple acceptance. What is remarkable is how we have normalized this internal conflict as though it were inevitable, as though the struggle between acceptance and resistance were an unavoidable feature of the human condition rather than a choice we make moment by moment. And how we tell ourselves stories about our unwillingness as though it were a permanent character trait rather than a temporary mental posture that can be released at any time through the simple practice of alignment with what is already occurring around us and within us. Consider the moment when something arrives that you did not expect, did not plan for, and do not want. Perhaps it is a diagnosis from a doctor, an unwelcome news from a loved one, a sudden loss of employment, or simply a day that unfolds entirely differently than you had imagined it would. Your immediate response, almost automatic and unbidden, is to resist. You feel the tension rise in your chest, the mind begins to spin with arguments against reality, you construct elaborate narratives about why this should not be happening, why it is unfair, why the universe has made a mistake in presenting this particular circumstance to you. This resistance consumes your energy, darkens your mood, and fractures your peace before you have even begun to address what has actually occurred. The Stoic philosophers understood that this resistance itself is the primary source of suffering, not the event that has arrived. Marcus Aurelius reflected deeply on the notion that external events are neither good nor bad in themselves. They simply are. What creates our torment is the layer of judgment we place upon them, the stories we tell ourselves about what they mean, the way we insist that reality should have conformed to our preferences. The mechanism at work here is straightforward and worth examining carefully. When something unwanted arrives, we are actually encountering two distinct phenomena: the event itself, which is neutral and indifferent to our opinion of it, and our reaction to that event, which carries all the emotional charge and suffering. Yet we live as though we are resisting the event when we are truly only resisting our own thoughts about it. This peculiar habit of mind has become so normalized in our culture that we scarcely notice it anymore. We speak of accepting circumstances as though it requires extraordinary virtue, when in truth acceptance is simply the act of ceasing to argue with what is already true. Consider the moment when you lie awake at night, your mind churning through scenarios that have not yet occurred, constructing elaborate narratives about conversations you might have tomorrow, presentations you might fail at, relationships that might deteriorate, or circumstances that might spiral beyond your control. You spend hours in this space of hypothetical suffering, burning through your mental energy as if these imagined futures were as real and present as the breath moving through your body right now. The ancient Stoics understood this particular trap of the human mind with remarkable clarity, recognizing that we do not suffer primarily from what actually happens to us in this moment, but rather from our insistence on mentally rehearsing what we believe might happen, what we fear will happen, or what we desperately wish would happen instead. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, and this observation points to something fundamental about how consciousness operates. When you engage in this anxious mental rehearsal, you are essentially stealing from your present moment to hand that stolen time over to an event that may never arrive, and even if it does arrive, it will arrive in a different form than you have imagined it. The mechanism underlying this pattern is rooted in our evolutionary heritage, the way our minds develop strategies to anticipate threats and prepare for danger. But in the modern world, this same mechanism fires constantly in response to uncertainties that pose no actual physical threat. We have normalized this state of preemptive worry so thoroughly that most people experience it as simply the way consciousness naturally operates, a background hum of anxiety that feels inevitable and unchangeable. Consider the person lying awake at 3 in the morning, mind racing through 1,000 scenarios of potential catastrophe. The job interview next week where everything might go wrong, the subtle tension in a relationship that could spiral into abandonment, the health symptom that might be serious, the financial misstep that could lead to ruin. This is the experience of anxiety without preparation, suffering multiplied by uncertainty, and the mind's tendency to populate the future with phantoms. The Stoic practice of Premeditatio malorum, or negative visualization, proposes something counterintuitive, that we should deliberately contemplate these potential misfortunes before they occur, not to invite despair, but to transform our relationship with fear itself. When we methodically imagine loss, rejection, illness, or failure in daylight hours with rational intention, something peculiar happens. The imagined catastrophe loses its power to ambush us in darkness because we have already faced it, already considered how we would respond, already recognized that we possess the capacity to endure. This is not pessimism or paranoia, rather it is the deliberate rehearsal of resilience. The mechanism works because fear thrives in abstraction and surprise. When we drag our anxieties into conscious examination, we strip away their mythological dimensions. We see that the loss of money is merely the loss of money, recoverable through effort. We recognize that rejection, while painful, does not unmake us. We understand that illness, should it come, finds us not as unprepared victims, but as people who have already contemplated their own fragility and found within themselves the capacity to persist. Yet we live in a culture that paradoxically forbids this kind of thinking, calling it negativity or catastrophizing, urging us instead to positive thinking alone. Consider the person who lies awake at night, mind racing with scenarios that have not yet occurred and may never occur at all. They imagine the conversation with their boss that will somehow go wrong, or the financial hardship that might arrive without warning, or the illness that could strike a loved one when they are least prepared to face it. These mental rehearsals of future suffering occupy hours of their waking life, stealing peace from the present moment in service of a future that exists only in imagination. The Stoic practice of premeditation, known as Premeditatio malorum, transforms this tendency from a source of anxiety into a disciplined preparation of the mind. Rather than allowing catastrophic thoughts to arise unbidden and uncontrolled, you deliberately summon them into consciousness, examine them carefully, and consider how you would respond with virtue and reason. When you premeditate adversity, you strip these imagined hardships of their power to shock and overwhelm you. By confronting the possibility of loss, rejection, or failure in advance, you discover that most of these scenarios are either manageable through rational action or entirely beyond your control, and therefore unworthy of genuine concern. The mechanism that makes this practice powerful is psychological in nature. Our minds fear the unknown and unexpected far more than we fear challenges we have already mentally rehearsed. When adversity arrives without warning, it bypasses our prepared defenses and strikes with full force. But when you have already imagined it, considered it, and planned your response, that same adversity becomes familiar ground rather than alien territory. You have already experienced it once in your mind, and you have already found yourself capable of enduring it through virtue and reason. Consider the person who receives an invitation to a social gathering several weeks in advance, yet spends the intervening days and nights constructing elaborate scenarios of rejection, embarrassment, and social failure. They imagine themselves saying the wrong thing, standing alone in the corner, or worse still, arriving to discover they were never truly wanted in the first place. This mental rehearsal of disaster consumes their energy long before the event ever occurs, and often the actual gathering proceeds without incident, yet the prior suffering was entirely real. The mechanism behind this ancient practice of expecting the worst is actually a form of psychological preparation rooted in survival logic. When our ancestors anticipated danger, they increased their chances of surviving by mentally rehearsing threat responses and having contingency plans ready. The brain, ancient and cautious by design, learned that pessimistic forecasting provided a sense of control and readiness. If we imagine the worst outcome and it fails to materialize, we feel relieved and grateful. If the worst does occur, we believe ourselves prepared, less shocked, and therefore more capable of response. There is a peculiar comfort in this grim accounting, a sense that our dark imaginings serve as protective magic. Yet we have normalized this exhausting habit so thoroughly in modern life that we rarely question whether this constant vigilance actually improves our circumstances or merely depletes our present moments. We sacrifice the peace available to us today for protection against futures that may never arrive, trading real serenity for imagined security. And this exchange persists because the cost is invisible, and the habit so deeply woven into how we think that we mistake worry for wisdom and anxiety for prudence. Consider the person who has invested their life savings into a failing business, who continues to pour money into it month after month, despite mounting losses and clear evidence that the venture will not succeed, all because they hope that next quarter will be different, that somehow circumstances will shift in their favor, that the market will suddenly reward their efforts with abundance. Or consider the individual who remains in a relationship that has become hollow and harmful, staying not because the present circumstances bring joy, but because they hope that their partner will change, that patience and love will transform the other person into who they wish them to be, that tomorrow will somehow restore what yesterday destroyed. Hope whispers to us that the future belongs to our desires rather than to the laws of cause and effect, and in this whisper, we lose our ability to see clearly what actually exists before us. The Stoic philosophers understood that hope often functions not as a virtue, but as a mechanism of self-deception, a way of avoiding the difficult work of accepting reality as it truly is, and making decisions based on what we can observe and verify rather than on what we wish to be true. When we allow hope to dominate our judgment, we become unable to distinguish between what is likely and what is merely possible, between what evidence supports and what our yearning demands, and in this confusion, we make choices that our clearer mind would immediately recognize as unwise. The mechanism works subtly because hope feels like optimism, feels like faith in ourselves and in life itself, yet beneath this comfortable feeling lies a refusal to see, a preference for the pleasant fiction over the difficult fact. We have normalized this distortion so thoroughly in modern life that we call it persistence rather than delusion, calling people dreamers rather than noticing they are simply avoiding the pain of honest appraisal, and so we can't. Consider the moment when you lie awake at 3 in the morning, your mind spinning with concerns about a presentation you must give next week, or a conversation you fear might go poorly, or a health worry that has taken root in your thoughts without any immediate evidence of genuine danger. In this moment, you are not actually experiencing the feared event itself, yet your body trembles as though you were, your heart races as though the threat were present, and your mind constructs elaborate scenarios of what might happen, each one more distressing than the last. This is the essential nature of fear in the modern world, for most of what we dread exists only in the territory of tomorrow, not in the actuality of today. We are suffering not from what is, but from what we imagine might be, and this distinction matters profoundly for understanding the mechanics of our own minds. Fear, in its truest form, is the mind's attempt to prepare us for future events by rehearsing disaster in the present moment, yet this rehearsal does not strengthen us or protect us in any meaningful way. Rather, it depletes our energy, clouds our judgment, and robs us of the peace available to us right now, in this very hour. The psychological mechanism is remarkably simple. Our ancient nervous system was designed to respond to immediate physical threats, yet modern life presents us with abstract, distant, and often imaginary dangers that activate the very same survival responses. We cannot distinguish between a tiger before us and the thought of a tiger tomorrow, so we treat anticipation as reality, and in doing so, we manufacture suffering in abundance. What makes this pattern so persistent and so normalized in contemporary life is that we have come to believe that worrying about the future somehow prevents bad outcomes, as though our anxiety were a form of protection or preparation. Consider the moment when you lie awake in bed at 3 in the morning, your mind racing through a conversation that happened weeks ago, replaying words you wish you had said differently, imagining how that person might have judged you, constructing entire narratives about consequences that may never materialize. Notice how your body tenses, how your breathing becomes shallow, how the darkness around you seems to amplify the urgency of these thoughts. You are not, in this moment, actually facing any immediate threat. The person is not before you, the conversation is not happening now, and yet your nervous system responds as though danger were imminent, as though these imagined futures were present realities demanding your immediate attention and vigilance. This is the fundamental nature of anxiety. It is exclusively an affair of time that has not yet arrived. The anxious mind is always somewhere other than where the body actually resides. It dwells in tomorrow, next week, next year, in 1,000 possible scenarios that branch outward like an endless tree of what-ifs, each one potentially catastrophic, each one demanding to be worried about right now. The mechanism is ancient and originally served a vital purpose. Your ancestors needed this capacity to imagine dangers not yet present, to prepare for threats that might emerge, to think ahead and plan defensively. But the modern world has corrupted this gift into a curse, for we now have the ability to imagine threats so numerous, so distant, and so unlikely that the anxious mind never runs out of material to process. We worry about things that may never happen, in scenarios we cannot control, at times we cannot predict, and our bodies respond by flooding us with chemicals designed for immediate physical danger. Consider the person who loses their composure in the face of a minor inconvenience, who allows their voice to rise and their face to redden over a delayed response from a colleague, or who feels their chest tighten and their thoughts scatter when someone disagrees with them in a meeting. In that moment, they believe themselves to be powerful, standing firm in their convictions, refusing to be pushed around by circumstances or other people. Yet observe what has truly happened. Their nervous system has been hijacked by an impulse they did not choose, their rational faculties have been temporarily abandoned, and they have surrendered control of their own mind and body to an external stimulus. This is not strength. This is the opposite of strength. Anger is a loss of command over oneself, a temporary chaos where reason yields to reaction. The mechanism is straightforward and rooted in our biology. When threatened or frustrated, our ancient limbic system floods our body with hormones designed for physical combat or escape, a response perfectly suited for our prehistoric ancestors, but catastrophically mismatched to our modern circumstances. In this state, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought and long-term planning, is partially suppressed. We become reactive rather than responsive, driven by impulse rather than intention. Yet we have somehow normalized this state as a sign of strength, as if losing control were equivalent to maintaining it, as if being overwhelmed by our own biology were a sign of power rather than its absence. We admire those who stand up for themselves through anger, who speak their mind without filter, who refuse to take it anymore, never recognizing that true strength lies in the opposite direction, in maintaining clarity when provoked, in choosing our words rather than having them chosen for us, in remaining unmoved by circumstances that demand our composure. When we lose someone we love, we do not simply experience the absence of their presence. Instead, we experience a profound judgment about how things ought to have been, how much longer they should have remained with us, how unfair the timing of their departure feels compared to some imagined standard of what is right and fair in this world. We grieve not merely for what we have lost, but for our judgment that this loss should not have occurred, that the universe has violated some unspoken contract we believed we had made simply by loving another person. The Stoic philosophers understood this principle with remarkable clarity. Grief, in its deepest form, is not sorrow about external events themselves, but judgment about those events, a rigid insistence that reality should conform to our preferences rather than accepting what has come to pass. When we examine our grief closely, we discover that the pain we feel is often intertwined with our rejection of what is, our resistance to the fact that death comes when it comes. That loss is part of the structure of existence itself. We judge the person's life span as insufficient, we judge the timing as wrong, we judge the fairness of their suffering or our suffering as unjust. These judgments layer upon the simple fact of their absence, multiplying our pain exponentially. Yet consider how this mechanism persists even in the face of universal human experience, even knowing that all things must pass and all people must eventually die. We continue to grieve as though this outcome were somehow unexpected, as though our grief can change what has already occurred. The judgment remains deeply embedded in our cultural understanding of loss as something necessarily tragic rather than something natural, something that can coexist with acceptance and peace. Consider the moment when you glimpse a photograph of someone you once knew, now living what appears to be an extraordinary life, traveling to places you have never seen, surrounded by people who seem genuinely happy in their company, possessing possessions that gleam with newness and promise. In that instant, a peculiar sensation rises within you, a tightening in the chest, a quickening of the mind, and suddenly your own life, which moments before felt perfectly adequate, now seems diminished, lacking, insufficient. This is envy in its most recognizable form, and the Stoics would have you understand that this response contains within it a profound logical error. When you envy another person's circumstances, you are essentially wishing that you possessed what they possess while somehow remaining yourself, but this wish contradicts the very nature of how lives are constructed and lived. Their possessions, their relationships, their experiences are woven into the fabric of their existence in ways you cannot fully perceive or understand from the outside, and to desire their external trappings while maintaining your own fundamental identity is to desire something impossible and incoherent. The mechanism at work here involves a comparison that ignores the totality of another person's life. Your mind selects only the visible peaks, the moments they choose to present to the world, while remaining blind to the valleys of their experience, the struggles they face, the doubts that plague them in their quiet hours. You construct an incomplete portrait and then judge your complete reality against this incomplete fantasy, which is why envy is not merely an unpleasant emotion, but a form of foolishness rooted in faulty perception. What makes this tendency persist despite its illogical nature is that modern life has become saturated with the cultivation of envy as an economic and social strategy. Consider the moment when a person stands before others and feels the weight of their own importance, believing themselves to be exceptional in ways that justify special treatment or elevated status, and you are witnessing one of the oldest and most persistent forms of self-deception that has ever taken root in the human mind. Pride presents itself as a rational assessment of one's own worth and accomplishments, yet when we examine it closely through the lens of reason, we discover that it is fundamentally a distortion of reality, a story we tell ourselves that bears little resemblance to our actual place in the world. The proud person believes their talents are theirs alone to claim credit for, forgetting the countless hours of instruction from teachers, the genetic inheritance from ancestors they never knew, the fortunate circumstances of birth that placed them in a position to develop their abilities at all, and the immeasurable contribution of luck and timing that accompanies every human achievement. They construct an identity based on superiority, yet this identity is built upon foundations of selective memory and willful ignorance about the true sources of their capacities. What makes pride particularly insidious is that it masquerades as confidence or self-respect, virtues we genuinely need to function well in the world, and because of this disguise, we rarely question it or examine it thoroughly. We have come to normalize the elevation of the self above others, celebrating it as ambition or healthy self-esteem rather than recognizing it as the fundamental confusion about reality that it truly is. The Stoic understanding cuts through this haze. Pride is a failure to see clearly, a preference for a comforting false narrative over the uncomfortable truth that we are small, temporary, and dependent upon forces far beyond our control. Consider the moment when you stand beneath a night sky unmarred by city lights, when thousands of stars pierce the darkness above you and the weight of infinite space settles upon your awareness. And in that instant, you feel simultaneously insignificant and connected, small yet part of something immeasurably vast and ancient. This experience has been the foundation of human wisdom traditions for millennia, yet in our modern existence, we have largely insulated ourselves from it, constructing barriers of artificial light and climate-controlled environments that separate us from the cosmic perspective that once humbled every generation before us. The mechanism beneath this humbling sensation operates through a simple but profound recognition. Your body occupies an infinitesimal fraction of space, your lifespan represents merely a blink in cosmic time, and the concerns that occupied your mind hours ago become meaningless when measured against the scale of stellar objects that have burned for billions of years. Your anxieties about social status, your resentments about minor slights, your preoccupation with possessions and comparisons, all of these dissolve into their proper proportions when you comprehend that you are literally made of stardust, that the atoms comprising your being were forged in the hearts of dying stars, and that your consciousness itself is an improbable emergent property in an apparently indifferent universe. Yet despite the accessibility of this perspective, despite our scientific knowledge confirming precisely how vast and ancient the cosmos truly is, we have normalized the forgetting of our cosmic insignificance. We move through our days as though our individual dramas constitute the central narrative of existence, as though our personal triumphs and failures represent genuine defeats or victories in any meaningful sense, when in fact we remain temporary arrangements of matter briefly capable of contemplation before rest. Consider the moment when you step outside on a clear night and look upward at the stars, that ancient practice that humans have engaged in for thousands of years, feeling the sudden contraction of your sense of self as you contemplate the incomprehensible vastness stretching above you, the billions of stars and galaxies and incomprehensibly distant nebulae that fill the cosmos, each one potentially harboring worlds and civilizations that dwarf your own existence in every conceivable measure. This experience of cosmic insignificance triggers something primal within us, a recognition that we are infinitesimally small creatures on an ordinary planet orbiting an unremarkable star in the outer regions of a galaxy among billions of others. Yet we move through our daily lives as though we are the center and measure of all importance. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what we might call perspective collapse, where our immediate sensory world and social environment become the totality of our conceptual universe, rendering us unable to hold simultaneously the truth of our cosmic insignificance with the practical reality of our human-scale existence. The Stoics understood this principle deeply, recognizing that the vastness of the universe ought naturally to humble us, to strip away petty concerns and artificial urgencies that consume our mental energy. Yet remarkably, despite the fact that this realization requires no special equipment or knowledge beyond basic astronomy, most people spend their lives entirely indifferent to this truth, conducting themselves with the same anxious self-importance, regardless of whether they have contemplated their cosmic smallness or not. We have normalized a kind of willful amnesia about our place in the universe, allowing ourselves to be consumed by rivalries and status competitions and material accumulations that mean nothing against the backdrop of eternity and infinite space, as though we have call. Consider the moment you find yourself rushing through your morning, moving from task to task with urgency, as though each hour contains infinite importance and consequence, only to realize by evening that the day has dissolved into memory like morning mist under sunlight, leaving behind only vague impressions of what you thought was so vital just hours before. This compression of time, this strange acceleration of our days into weeks and years, represents one of the most peculiar aspects of human consciousness, yet we treat it as inevitable rather than as a phenomenon worthy of deep examination. The Stoic philosophers understood that our existence is indeed a brief flash against the backdrop of eternity, a momentary appearance in an infinite timeline where empires rise and crumble to dust, where mountains themselves erode into valleys, and where the greatest human achievements become archaeological curiosities buried beneath layers of civilization. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. We live in constant distraction, fragmenting our attention across dozens of concerns simultaneously, which creates an illusion of expansion even as time itself accelerates past us at an unchanging rate. Our minds, overwhelmed with notifications, obligations, and manufactured urgencies, paradoxically make time feel both endless in the moment and instantaneous in retrospect, leaving us perpetually disoriented about the actual passage of our finite days. We have normalized this state of cognitive fragmentation so thoroughly that we rarely question whether our frantic pace serves any authentic purpose, or whether it merely obscures the sobering truth that our window of existence remains stubbornly brief regardless of how we fill it. The Stoic invitation is not to despair at this brevity, but rather to recognize that its shortness renders our choices about attention and presence profoundly meaningful, suggesting that awareness of our flash existence me. Consider the nature of all things as the ancient atomists understood them. Everything that exists is composed of atoms, tiny indivisible particles moving through infinite void, and nothing more than this exists in the universe. When you look at your hand before sleep, when you regard the ceiling above you in the darkness, when you feel the weight of your body against the mattress, you are witnessing arrangements of atoms and empty space, nothing fundamentally different from the dust mote floating through a shaft of light or the stone wall outside your window. The distinction your mind makes between yourself and the world around you, between the solid and the ethereal, between matter and emptiness, dissolves when examined through this lens of ancient philosophy. Your thoughts themselves are merely atoms in motion within your brain. Your emotions are chemical cascades following mechanical laws. Your sense of being a unified self is an illusion created by the rapid coordination of countless particles interacting according to necessity and chance. Yet despite understanding this truth intellectually, you continue to move through life as though you are something special, something separate from the material world, something that deserves protection and elevation and constant attention. You persist in treating your worries as though they are fundamental truths rather than temporary arrangements of matter that will eventually disperse into the void from which they arose. This persistence of illusion despite rational knowledge reveals something profound about human consciousness. We cannot truly live according to what we know to be intellectually true about the nature of reality. We cannot genuinely feel ourselves as atoms because our very capacity to feel, to care, to experience continuity of self requires that we maintain this useful fiction. Consider the clay vessel sitting before you, shaped by the potter's hands into a form that holds water and serves your daily needs, yet the clay itself remains unchanged in its essential nature, indifferent to the shape it temporarily assumes. The Stoics understood that all material things in this world exist as a kind of temporary marriage between matter and form, between the formless substance and the design imposed upon it, and this recognition offers us profound peace when we truly internalize its implications. When you observe your own body moving through space, executing the tasks you have set before it, you might believe that this particular arrangement of flesh and bone and sinew constitutes your true self. Yet the matter that composes you is constantly being exchanged with the world around you through breath and nourishment and the ordinary processes of living. The form you inhabit today bears little resemblance at the molecular level to the form you inhabited 7 years ago, and yet something within you persists, something continues, something that you call yourself despite this complete material turnover. We have become accustomed to identifying so fiercely with the temporary forms that our matter assumes that we suffer greatly when those forms inevitably change or deteriorate or eventually dissolve entirely. The clay does not mourn becoming a cup, nor does it celebrate when shaped into a plate, because the clay understands implicitly what we must learn through philosophy, which is that the form is merely a temporary assignment, a brief employment of the matter for a particular purpose, and that our anxieties about maintaining a specific form are rooted in a fundamental confusion about what we actually are. When you look in the mirror and see changes in your appearance, when you notice strength fading or skin aging or hair graying, you are observing the natural and inevitable process of form shifting while the matter itself continues. Consider the moment when you experience frustration at a traffic jam, your hands tightening on the wheel, your breath becoming shallow, your mind spiraling into complaints about lost time and inefficiency, as though the universe has personally wronged you by placing these vehicles between you and your destination. In this moment, you are caught in a fundamental misunderstanding of cause and effect, believing that external circumstances directly cause your emotional suffering, when in truth the only cause of your agitation is your judgment about what these circumstances mean. The traffic jam itself is merely a neutral fact, a confluence of mechanical and human factors operating according to natural law, yet you have added a layer of interpretation that transforms it into something personal and offensive. This is the mechanism that deceives us continually. We attribute our mental disturbance to outside events when the actual cause originates entirely within our faculty of choice, our ability to assent or refuse assent to the impressions that arise. The Stoic philosophers understood that between any external event and our emotional response lies a critical space where our reasoning power operates, and in that space we are entirely free, yet we habitually collapse this space by treating our automatic reactions as though they were inevitable consequences rather than choices we are making. We have normalized the belief that others can hurt us, that circumstances can defeat us, that external things possess power over our inner state, and we perpetuate this fiction so consistently that it feels like simple reality rather than a learnable habit that can be unlearned. As you rest now, notice how you might practice distinguishing between what happens and what you decide it means, recognizing that your peace of mind depends not on the absence of difficulty, but on your clear understanding that no external cause can touch the freedom of your mind unless you. Consider the moment when you face uncertainty about your future, and your mind naturally divides into two opposing camps of thought. One voice whispers that everything happens for a reason, that some divine intelligence or benevolent force guides your steps and orchestrates events toward your ultimate good, while another voice insists that you are merely a collection of atoms bouncing randomly through an indifferent universe, subject to nothing but chance and mechanical causation, where meaning is something you impose rather than discover. This ancient tension between providence and atomism has haunted human consciousness since the earliest philosophers, and it persists today in the way we frame our anxieties and hopes about what lies ahead. The Stoic philosophers recognize that this binary choice often creates unnecessary suffering because we invest enormous psychological energy in determining which worldview is true, believing that our peace of mind depends entirely upon getting the answer correct. Yet consider what actually happens in your life. Whether you believe in divine providence or random atoms, you still wake each morning and face the same decisions, encounter the same difficulties, and must respond with the same virtue and effort. The real mechanism at work here is your mind's desperate search for certainty in an inherently uncertain world, and this search itself becomes the source of distress, because you cannot definitively prove either position through reason alone, leaving you suspended in doubt. What persists despite this logical impasse is our normalized habit of choosing sides, of becoming advocates for one cosmology over another, as though the answer were somehow knowable and consequential to how we should actually live today. Consider the way a season passes into memory and then returns again, the way autumn leaves fall and decay into soil, only for spring to emerge from that same earth with new growth that will eventually fall again in an endless cycle that requires no intervention from us and asks nothing but our observation. The ancient Stoics understood that all phenomena operate within patterns of return, that what departs will eventually come back in some form, and that this principle applies not only to the obvious cycles of nature, but also to our own experiences, our emotional states, our struggles, and even the particular configurations of difficulty that we believe are unique to our suffering. When you face a challenge that feels unprecedented and overwhelming, the Stoic perspective invites you to recognize that some version of this trial has occurred before in human history, that others have stood where you stand, felt what you feel, and emerged from it through the same inner resources that remain available to you in this moment. The mechanism operating here is one of profound humility and perspective, for when we understand that all things return, we cease to grant our present circumstances the power of absolute novelty or special significance, and we recognize instead that we are participating in patterns larger than ourselves, rhythms that predate our birth and will continue long after our departure. Yet despite this knowledge having been available to thoughtful people for thousands of years, we continue to treat our personal crises as though they have never occurred before, as though the anxiety we experience today has no precedent, as though the loss we face has somehow broken the ancient laws of return that govern everything else in existence. We have normalized a peculiar forgetting, where we simultaneously know intellectually that all things cycle and return, and yet we live emotionally as though our moment exists outside those cycles, exempt fro. Consider the natural world around you, where nothing truly disappears but instead transforms into something new, where the fallen leaf returns to soil and becomes nutrients for the root system of the tree that shed it, where the body of the deer nourishes the wolf pack and the forest floor alike, where death and decay are not endpoints, but rather transition points in an endless cycle of material exchange and regeneration. This principle, fundamental to all biological systems, suggests that loss and renewal are not separate phenomena, but interwoven aspects of a single continuous process. And yet we experience our personal losses as if they represent true ending, true destruction, true absence. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our tendency to perceive our own individual narratives as somehow exempt from the universal laws that govern all other matter, as though our suffering and our losses carry a weight and permanence that transcends the material world we inhabit, and this perception creates a false sense of isolation from the regenerative cycles we witness everywhere in nature. We normalize this disconnection by compartmentalizing our understanding, accepting intellectually that all matter cycles and transforms while emotionally insisting that our particular griefs and our particular circumstances exist outside this pattern, and we have built entire cultures around the denial of our participation in these fundamental processes. Yet the Stoic perspective invites us to recognize that in accepting the circular regeneration of all things, we paradoxically find freedom, for our losses become not terminations but redistributions, our pain becomes not pointless destruction but necessary transformation, and our death becomes not an ending but a return, a joining with the substrate from which we emerged, allowing us to rest deeply knowing that nothing of true value is ever truly wasted in the universe's great turning. Imagine yourself lying in bed at night and consider this question with absolute seriousness. If you were to live this exact day again, tomorrow, and the day after that, and again for all eternity, would you feel contentment or despair? The Stoics, particularly Nietzsche, who drew from their wisdom, understood that this thought experiment reveals everything about how you are truly living. Picture a day in your modern existence, the mundane details of it, the choices you make from morning until sleep, the conversations you have, the work you perform, the way you treat others in moments when no one is watching. Now stretch that day infinitely backward and forward through time, an endless loop with no variation, no escape, no final resting place. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound and unsettling. When you examine your life through this lens of eternal return, you suddenly become aware of the gap between the life you are actually living and the life you wish you were living. You notice the small compromises, the resentments you carry, the time spent on things that do not truly matter to you, the relationships you maintain out of habit rather than genuine connection. The mechanism works because it removes the comfortable illusion of linear time and infinite future chances. We live as though we have endless tomorrows to become the person we wish to be, to repair the damage we have done, to finally pursue what matters. This persistent delusion persists despite having no logical foundation whatsoever. You know with certainty that your time is finite, that you will die, that the chances you do not take today are chances genuinely lost. Yet we continue to postpone, to procrastinate, to compromise our values for temporary comfort or approval. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we barely notice it anymore. Imagine standing beneath a night sky so vast and incomprehensible that your mind struggles to grasp the sheer scale of it all. And then consider that the ancient Stoics believed that eventually, through a process they called ekpyrosis, the entire cosmos would undergo a complete and total conflagration, a universal fire that would consume all matter, all energy, all existence itself, returning everything to its primordial state before a new cycle of creation would begin anew. This was not merely religious speculation, but a cosmological framework that shaped how these philosophers understood the nature of impermanence and the futility of clinging to any single form or possession or even identity. The mechanism behind this ancient vision rests on a profound logical deduction about the nature of cycles and transformation in the physical world. For they observed that fire consumes wood and transforms it into ash, that seasons change and return, that all things that come into being must eventually pass away, and they extrapolated this pattern to its ultimate conclusion, reasoning that if all particular things are subject to decay and destruction, then the universe itself, being composed of these very things, must also be subject to the same inevitable law of dissolution and renewal. Yet despite the perfect logical consistency of this framework, despite its ability to explain the transients we observe in every corner of our experience, we continue to live as though our circumstances are permanent, as though our achievements will endure, as though the structures we build and the status we accumulate will somehow remain forever fixed and immutable, even though we possess no rational basis for this assumption and can observe endless evidence to the contrary throughout the natural world. Imagine standing in a forest at dawn, watching the mist rise from the earth while leaves tremble in the gentle wind, and birds begin their songs in an orchestrated symphony that no single conductor has arranged, yet which unfolds with perfect timing and harmony across thousands of species. The ancient Stoics called this phenomenon the world's soul, or pneuma, a universal breath that animates all things, connecting every creature and element in an invisible web of shared existence and mutual causation. This concept invites us to recognize that we are not isolated islands of consciousness trapped in separate bodies, but rather expressions of a single, living whole that breathes through us and around us, just as our own breath moves in and out of our lungs without requiring our constant, deliberate attention. The mechanism behind this perception rests on a simple observation about interconnectedness. Everything in nature responds to everything else. The roots drink from the same soil, the air carries signals between distant organisms, the cycles of seasons affect all beings simultaneously, and the fundamental laws of physics operate identically whether we witness them in a distant nebula or in the chemistry of our own cells. We have normalized the illusion of separateness through language and thought, creating artificial boundaries between self and world, between human and nature, between my breath and the planet's breath, when in reality these divisions exist only in our minds as convenient mental tools rather than as descriptions of actual truth. As you rest now, consider that your breathing is not separate from the world's breathing, that the oxygen entering your lungs was recently released by plants thousands of miles away, that the carbon dioxide you exhale will nourish those same plants, and that this exchange has continued unbroken for countless millennia, making you not merely alive in the world, but alive as part of the world, breathing why. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, your body settling into stillness, and you become aware of your own breathing as a living force moving through you. The ancient Greeks called this pneuma, the vital breath that animates all things, and as you observe this gentle rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, you might notice how this air enters your body as something entirely outside yourself and becomes, through the simple act of breathing, indistinguishable from your own being. It becomes you. The mechanism at work here is both biological and philosophical. The lungs extract oxygen and distribute it through the bloodstream, The body converts this external element into energy, into consciousness, into the very thoughts and sensations that constitute your existence. Yet we rarely pause to recognize this extraordinary process, this continuous exchange between what is not us and what we consider to be ourselves. The boundary between self and world dissolves with each breath we take. And this dissolution happens automatically, without our permission or awareness. It is so fundamental to our existence that we have normalized it into invisibility. The Stoics understood that pneuma was not merely a physical phenomenon but a spiritual one, that the same vital force flowing through your lungs flows through all living things, through trees and animals and the wind itself, and that by observing this breath without resistance, without trying to control it, you recognize your connection to something larger than your individual self. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let this realization settle with you that you are not a separate entity breathing air, but rather you are breath itself, continuously becoming and unbecoming, a temporary gathering of pneuma that will one day disperse back into the world from which it came. This understanding requires no effort, only attention, only the willingness to observe what has always been present. Consider the moment when you first hold a newborn child, whether your own or that of someone close to you, and notice how your body responds before your mind has time to construct reasons for the response. Your breathing slows, your voice softens, your hands become deliberate and careful, and there emerges a pull toward protection so immediate and so powerful that it requires no justification or instruction. This is oikeiosis, the natural affection that the Stoics understood as a fundamental orientation of living beings toward their own existence and toward those connected to them by blood and proximity. The mechanism operates beneath conscious deliberation, beginning in infancy when a child naturally clings to its mother, not because it has reasoned that survival depends upon her, but because nature has written this inclination into the very fabric of its being. This drive extends outward in concentric circles, moving from self-preservation to the protection of offspring, then to siblings and parents, then to the broader community, and eventually to all of humanity. The Stoics did not view this as selfish or contrary to virtue, but rather as the appropriate starting point from which reason must work, since we cannot transcend our nature, but must instead harmonize our rational choices with these deep biological and social orientations. What persists as remarkable, even in our modern age of individualism and self-examination, is how readily we dismiss or intellectualize this fundamental pull, as though acknowledging natural affection somehow diminishes our autonomy or rationality, when in truth it simply reminds us that we are animals embedded in networks of care and obligation that predate language and philosophy themselves. The parent who stays awake through a child's fever, the adult child who moves closer to aging parents, the stranger who instinctively reaches to steady someone about to fall, these are oikeiosis in action, moments. Consider the moment when you encounter a stranger from a distant land, someone whose language sounds foreign, whose customs seem peculiar, whose values appear fundamentally different from those you were raised to hold dear, and notice how your mind instinctively creates a boundary, a line of separation between us and them, between your people and theirs, between those who belong and those who do not. This impulse to divide humanity into tribes and nations and ethnic groups and religious communities is so deeply woven into the fabric of your consciousness that it feels not like a choice but like a natural law of existence, as though the world simply came divided this way and your loyalty to your own corner of it is both necessary and virtuous. Yet the Stoics understood something that we have largely forgotten or chosen to ignore, that this tribal instinct, however ancient and however comfortable it makes us feel, is ultimately a delusion born from provincial thinking and a failure to see with clarity. When you truly examine the matter with philosophical honesty, you come to recognize that you share the same fundamental nature with every human being regardless of where they were born or what flag waves above their childhood home, that your capacity for reason and virtue and suffering and joy is identical to theirs, that the accidents of geography and circumstance that separated you at birth are precisely that, accidents, meaningless in the face of your common humanity. The psychological mechanism at work here is the human tendency to organize society into manageable groups, to create in groups that provide safety and identity and purpose. And there is nothing wrong with loving your family or your community or your homeland, yet when this natural affection transforms into exclusion, and when it prevents you from recognizing the inherent dignity of those outside your borders, then it becomes a cage. Consider the moment when you encounter a stranger on the street, someone from a different country, a different culture, someone whose language you do not speak and whose customs remain foreign to you. Yet in that moment of genuine connection, you recognize something unmistakable in their eyes. The same fear, the same longing, the same fundamental vulnerability that lives within yourself. The Stoic philosophers understood this recognition as the foundation of what they called brotherhood of man, not as a sentimental ideal, but as a logical observation about the nature of human existence itself. Every person who walks this earth shares with you the same basic requirements for survival, the same capacity for suffering, the same awareness of mortality, the same inner voice that questions and doubts and hopes for something beyond the immediate moment. We are bound together not by choice or circumstance alone, but by the simple biological and metaphysical fact that we are all participants in the same human condition, all struggling with desires we cannot fully control, all facing losses we cannot prevent, all searching for meaning in a universe that does not announce its purposes. Yet despite this obvious and fundamental unity, we have constructed elaborate systems of separation, walls of identity and tribe and nation that convince us that the stranger deserves something other than our compassion, that their suffering matters less than ours, that their fundamental humanity is somehow diminished by differences of appearance or belief. The mechanism behind this separation is understandable. Our minds evolved to prioritize those closest to us, those who share our immediate survival interests, and this ancient wiring persists even when the logic that created it no longer applies. Consider the moment when you find yourself at a gathering where someone you know enters the room, and without conscious deliberation, you feel the subtle pull to acknowledge them, to engage with them, to offer some measure of your attention and presence to their existence. This impulse arises not from calculation or strategic advantage, but from something deeper, something the ancients understood as woven into the fabric of our nature as social beings. The Stoics recognized that we are born into relationship, that we arrive in a world already populated with others, and that our very survival and development depend upon the cooperation and care of those around us. This fundamental truth creates what we might call a social debt, an inherent obligation that does not require contract or agreement, but rather flows naturally from the simple fact that we exist among other people. When you pass someone on the street, when you receive a kindness from a stranger, when you benefit from the accumulated knowledge and labor of generations before you, you incur a bond that calls for reciprocation. The mechanism operates silently within us, a kind of internal compass that points toward duty even when no external reward awaits. We feel obligated to listen to a friend's troubles not because we gain financially, but because the bonds of relationship themselves demand our presence and care. This sense of social duty persists with remarkable constancy across cultures and centuries, suggesting it is not a construct we invented, but rather something we discovered about ourselves. Yet in modern life, we often question these duties, attempting to calculate their worth or negotiate their terms as though obligation were optional. The ancients teach us instead that these duties are inherent, built into our existence as surely as breath enters our lungs, and that recognizing this truth brings not burden but peace. When you encounter someone struggling with a problem, whether it is a colleague wrestling with a difficult decision at work, a friend bearing the weight of emotional pain, or a stranger who has lost their way in an unfamiliar place, you face a moment of choice that defines not merely your actions, but the very character you are building within yourself. The Stoic understands that to help another person navigate their difficulties is not an external obligation imposed by society or religion, but rather an expression of your deepest nature as a rational being connected to all of humanity through shared reason and mortality. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that we are made for cooperation, that human beings function as parts of a greater whole, much as our hands and feet serve the body without demanding recognition or reward for their service. When you offer genuine assistance to another person, you are not performing charity in the modern sense of providing what they lack, but rather you are exercising your capacity for virtue itself, for helping others reflects back onto your own soul and strengthens the very qualities that make you excellent. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound. By choosing to assist others in their struggles, you cultivate patience, empathy, practical wisdom, and a healthy perspective on your own difficulties. For there is something humbling about recognizing that others face challenges as real and significant as your own. Yet we often find ourselves hesitant to help without expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement, and we have normalized the belief that our assistance must be acknowledged, that others should appreciate our sacrifice, or that helping should come naturally only to those closest to us. The Stoic rejects this entirely and instead recognizes that the virtue found in helping others requires no external validation whatsoever, for the true reward resides in the development of your character. Consider the moment when you face a choice between what benefits you alone and what benefits your community, your family, or the broader collective to which you belong, and notice how the modern mind often experiences this as a painful conflict rather than a natural alignment of values. You might possess the ability to cut corners in your work to save yourself time and effort, yet doing so would compromise the quality of what others depend upon, and in that instant, you feel the pull of competing loyalties that seem irreconcilable. The Stoic understanding dissolves this apparent conflict by recognizing that you are not fundamentally separate from the whole of which you are a part, that your individual good and the common good are not opposing forces, but rather expressions of the same underlying harmony that governs all nature. When you choose to prioritize the welfare of others, to contribute honestly to shared endeavors, to sacrifice personal convenience for collective benefit, you are not diminishing yourself, but rather fulfilling your deepest nature as a rational being designed for community and cooperation. The mechanism at work here involves recognizing that human beings evolved and survive only through mutual aid and collective effort, that your ancestors thrived because they understood themselves as threads in a larger tapestry rather than isolated units competing for dominance. Yet in our contemporary world, we have normalized a different narrative, one that celebrates individual achievement and personal gain above all else, one that frames generosity as loss and cooperation as weakness, and we have so thoroughly internalized this perspective that choosing the common good often feels like self-betrayal. The ancient Stoics would have found this inversion deeply puzzling, for they understood that the person who serves the common good actually serves themselves most completely, that virtue and enlightened self-interest converge in them. Consider the worker who arrives at the office each morning, spending the majority of their waking hours contributing to systems and structures far larger than themselves, understanding that their individual effort, however small it may seem, becomes part of something that extends beyond their personal existence and benefit. They are one cell in a vast organism, one soldier in an army, one craftsperson in a civilization, and the Stoic philosophers recognized this fundamental truth about human nature with remarkable clarity and acceptance. The mechanism underlying this reality is not punishment or tyranny, but rather the simple observation that humans are inherently social creatures, evolved and structured to function within communities, and that the health and survival of the whole directly determines the well-being of each individual member within it. When the city thrives, the citizen thrives. When the organism flourishes, each cell receives nourishment and purpose. When society functions with justice and order, even those who sacrifice most directly benefit from the security and meaning that collective success provides. We have normalized this arrangement so thoroughly that we rarely question it, accepting without examination that our days belong partially to purposes we did not choose, to people we did not select, to institutions we did not create, yet we find ourselves bound to them nonetheless. The remarkable insight the ancient Stoics offered was not resistance to this arrangement, but rather a profound reframing of how we experience it, suggesting that recognizing our place within the whole, understanding our role in something greater, and accepting the necessity of individual service to collective welfare does not diminish us, but rather elevates us, transforming obligation into participation, duty into honor, and sacrifice into the deepest form of meaning available to mortal beings. Consider the single raindrop falling from a vast storm cloud, carrying within it the same composition, the same properties, the same essential nature as the entire system from which it came, and in studying that one drop, a naturalist might understand something true about the whole formation above. This principle extends far beyond meteorology into the very structure of how we understand ourselves and our place within larger systems. When you examine a single day of your life with careful attention, you begin to notice that the patterns, struggles, and small victories contained within those 24 hours often reflect the broader patterns of your entire existence, your year, your decade, the arc of your whole life unfolding. The way you respond to a minor frustration at work mirrors how you respond to major adversities. The quality of attention you bring to a casual conversation with a stranger reveals the quality of attention you bring to your most important relationships. The care with which you arrange your immediate physical space suggests something true about how you order your inner world. The Stoics understood that by observing the microcosm, one gains genuine insight into the macrocosm, that the part is never truly separate from the whole, but rather contains its essential signature within itself. Yet we often live as though this principle does not apply to us, treating different areas of our lives as disconnected territories, believing we can be careless in small matters while maintaining excellence in large ones, or that our private thoughts have no bearing on our public actions. We have constructed elaborate mental partitions that allow us to compartmentalize, to pretend that integrity works differently depending on the scale of the situation, when in reality, every choice reinforces patterns that extend throughout the entire system of who we are. Consider the peculiar moment when you find yourself deeply troubled by a minor disagreement with a colleague, noticing how your chest tightens, how your thoughts spiral into catastrophe, and how you begin to construct elaborate narratives about what this interaction means for your future at work, your reputation, your entire professional standing, when in reality a few words were exchanged that held no inherent meaning beyond themselves. In this moment, you are experiencing the ancient principle of microcosm and macrocosm, the recognition that the small patterns within our inner world often mirror and magnify the larger patterns of existence itself. The Stoics understood that when we observe our mind reacting with disproportionate intensity to minor events, we are witnessing a fundamental human tendency to project vastness onto smallness, to treat the finite as infinite, to transform a momentary discomfort into a total existential threat. The mechanism operates this way. Our minds do not exist in isolation, but rather as small ecosystems reflecting the larger world around us. And every internal disturbance we create through excessive worry, rumination, and catastrophizing becomes a microcosmic representation of how we fragment reality itself through perception and judgment. We take a single conversation and expand it into a narrative about our worth. We take a single failure and construct it into proof of our incompetence. We take a single moment of awkwardness and inflate it into a permanent stain on our social existence. The remarkable aspect of this tendency is how thoroughly normalized it has become, how we discuss our anxieties with others and find immediate recognition and validation, as though the mind's habit of magnification were simply the accurate description of reality rather than a distortion imposed upon it. Consider the person who wakes each morning with a mind clouded by anxiety and self-doubt, who moves through the world with shoulders hunched and eyes averted, and who finds that every interaction with others seems to confirm their deepest fears of rejection and unworthiness. For they notice how people seem distant and critical, how opportunities seem to slip away, how the world itself appears hostile and unwelcoming to their existence. Yet if we examine this phenomenon carefully, we discover that what appears to be an external reality shaped by fate or circumstance is in fact a direct manifestation of the internal landscape they carry within themselves, because the mind projects its own state onto everything it perceives, coloring conversations with suspicion when the internal voice speaks only of inadequacy, transforming neutral facial expressions into judgments through the lens of shame, and creating the very isolation that the anxious person fears by withdrawing before others have any chance to withdraw from them. The mechanism operates with perfect consistency and logical precision, for we cannot authentically connect with others when we do not believe ourselves worthy of connection. We cannot recognize opportunity when we are paralyzed by the conviction that we will fail, and we cannot experience the world as fundamentally safe when our interior landscape is defined by threat and dread. What strikes us most profoundly is how this principle persists across countless lives and situations, how we have somehow normalized the idea that external circumstances are responsible for our suffering, when in truth the external world largely reflects back to us the contents of our own consciousness, and how readily we accept this inversion as truth rather than recognizing ourselves as the architects of the worlds we inhabit. For the Stoics understood that mastery begins not with controlling circumstances, but with cultivating the interior garden from. Consider the moment when you observe a forest ecosystem functioning without instruction, without planning committees or strategic oversight, where each organism from the smallest insect to the tallest tree participates in an intricate web of relationships that sustains the whole. The roots draw nutrients from soil that has been enriched by countless cycles of decay and renewal. The canopy filters sunlight in precise mathematical proportions that allow understory plants to flourish. Predator and prey populations regulate themselves through natural feedback loops that no conscious mind designed, yet somehow persist in remarkable equilibrium. This is not chaos masquerading as order, but rather a rational system operating according to principles that the ancient Stoics recognized as universal law, a logos that permeates all of existence and requires no external authority to enforce its rules. The mechanism behind this phenomenon rests upon a simple but profound truth, that nature operates through cause and effect, through patterns and consequences that repeat themselves across millennia, and every organism that survives does so by aligning itself with these underlying principles rather than resisting them. A river does not question why it flows downward, the seasons do not debate whether they should change, and yet somehow this vast mechanical operation generates what appears to us as wisdom, as if the universe itself possesses a rational intelligence guiding every process. We have become so accustomed to seeing nature as something separate from reason, as something wild and chaotic that must be conquered and controlled by human intellect, that we forget the ancient insight that the most rational order humanity could ever devise already exists all around us, embedded in every ecosystem, encoded in every biological process, waiting only for us to recognize it and find our rightful place within it rather than above it. Consider the traveler who arrives in an unfamiliar city, surrounded by winding streets and unmarked passages, feeling genuinely lost and uncertain about which direction leads toward safety or shelter or purpose. And in that moment of vulnerability, a local resident approaches and offers to show the way, and the traveler, almost without conscious deliberation, begins to follow. Trusting implicitly in the knowledge and experience of this stranger, simply because they present themselves with confidence and familiarity with the landscape. The psychological mechanism operating here is profound and deeply rooted in our evolutionary history, for throughout human existence, our survival has depended upon the ability to recognize and follow those who possessed knowledge we lacked, to defer to expertise and experience in domains where we ourselves were blind or ignorant, and this instinct served us well when the guide truly knew the territory, when the elder understood which plants were poisonous and which nourishing, when the experienced hunter recognized the signs of dangerous animals. Yet what persists in modern life is our tendency to extend this same deference far beyond its rational boundaries, to follow guides in matters where no genuine expertise exists, to trust the presentation of confidence over the substance of actual knowledge, to surrender our own judgment to those who merely claim authority or who possess some superficial marker of credibility. We follow guides into financial ruin because they speak with certainty about markets they cannot predict. We follow guides into ideological certainties because they present their opinions with unwavering conviction. We follow guides away from our own instincts and away from careful reasoning simply because following requires less effort than thinking independently. Consider the moment when you receive news that troubles you, perhaps a critical email from a colleague or an unexpected change in your plans, and notice how quickly your mind accepts this initial impression as truth, allowing worry to flood through your body before you have examined anything carefully. The Stoics understood that between the event itself and your suffering lies a critical juncture where you must pause and examine whether you have truly assented to the impression as real and significant, or whether you have simply allowed it to occupy your mind without scrutiny. An impression arrives unbidden, like a visitor appearing at your door, but you retain the sovereign power to accept or reject it, to say yes or no to its claim on your attention and emotional energy. When you receive the impression that you are humiliated by someone's words, the impression itself is not within your control, yet your assent to the truth of that impression absolutely is, and in that narrow space between stimulus and response lies your freedom and your peace. The mechanism here involves recognizing that impressions are merely the brain's initial interpretations, shaped by your past experiences, your current emotional state, and your habitual patterns of thinking, none of which necessarily reflects reality with accuracy or completeness. Most people move through their days assenting to impressions automatically, as though they were facts carved in stone, accepting that they are inadequate, that they will fail, that others judge them harshly, without ever pausing to question whether these impressions deserve their agreement. We have normalized this unconscious assent to the point where we no longer notice we are doing it, treating our first impressions as final verdicts rather than tentative hypotheses that deserve examination and testing. Consider the moment when you first wake in the middle of the night, startled by a sound you cannot quite identify, and your mind immediately constructs an entire narrative around that impression without any actual evidence to support it. You lie there in the darkness, certain that you heard footsteps in the hallway or perhaps a window opening downstairs, and your body responds accordingly with quickened heartbeat and shallow breathing, even though you have not yet moved to investigate or confirm what you actually heard. The Stoics called this catalepsis, or cataleptic impression, the initial appearance that strikes the mind before reason has an opportunity to examine it, and Marcus Aurelius spent considerable effort training himself to recognize the moment between the impression and the assent he gave to it. What makes this phenomenon so compelling is that the impression arrives in your consciousness with a sense of absolute certainty, as though it carries its own verification, and it is only through deliberate examination that you begin to notice how many of your cataleptic impressions prove to be distortions or fabrications rather than accurate representations of reality. We accept these first impressions as truth throughout our daily lives without questioning them, allowing someone's tone of voice to convince us they are angry when perhaps they are merely tired, or interpreting a friend's silence as judgment when they might simply be preoccupied with their own concerns. The mechanism that created this system of immediate impression evolved to keep us alive in environments where hesitation could be fatal, where the impression of danger needed to trigger action before the full reasoning mind could complete its analysis. Yet in our modern world, this same system generates false alarms constantly, filling our minds with narratives that have no basis in evidence. Consider the moment when you encounter a person whose behavior strikes you as foolish or contemptible, when someone makes a choice that seems obviously wrong, or when circumstances unfold in a way that appears to confirm your immediate assessment of what has occurred. Your mind moves with remarkable speed to construct a narrative, to assign blame, to determine worth and culpability, and this process happens so automatically that you may believe you are simply observing reality rather than interpreting it. Yet the Stoics understood something fundamental about this tendency. The judgment you render in haste contains only a fraction of the information required to render it truthfully. When you see a person acting in ways that seem irrational, you are viewing a single frame of an entire film whose plot you do not fully comprehend. You do not know the fears that drive them, the experiences that have shaped their reasoning, the pressures exerted upon them, or the conversations they have had when you were not present. What appears as stupidity might be desperation, what looks like cruelty might be fear, what seems like weakness might be a carefully considered choice born from wisdom you have not yet encountered. The psychological mechanism at work here is the mind's natural tendency to complete patterns with the information available, to fill gaps with assumptions, to seek closure and certainty rather than dwell in uncomfortable ambiguity. We have normalized the habit of instant judgment because it provides a sense of control and understanding in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. Yet this normalization comes at a profound cost, for each hasty judgment we make becomes a barrier between ourselves and genuine understanding, a wall erected between ourselves and others who deserve at minimum our curiosity before our condemnation. Consider the moment when you receive news that disturbs you, perhaps a critical comment from a colleague, a concerning health symptom, or a troubling headline that captures your attention, and notice how immediately your mind rushes forward to construct a complete narrative around this information, assigning it meaning, building elaborate interpretations, and committing your emotional resources to this hastily constructed story as though it were already established truth. The ancient Stoics understood this impulse and gave it a name through the concept of epische, borrowed from the skeptical philosophers, which means to suspend judgment, to withhold your assent to the initial impression that arises in your consciousness. This mechanism works because our minds are designed to move quickly toward conclusions, to find patterns and make predictions, to create coherence from fragments of information, and this speed served us well when we faced immediate physical threats. But in our modern world of complexity and nuance, this same mechanism often leads us astray. When you withhold assent, you are not denying that something occurred. Rather, you are refusing to immediately agree with your mind's first interpretation of what it means, creating space between the raw impression and your judgment about it. Yet despite the logical clarity of this practice, we find ourselves perpetually falling into the trap of instant assent, treating our reactive thoughts as if they were reliable verdicts handed down from some authority on truth, allowing anxiety and assumptions to accumulate into conviction before we have gathered sufficient information or perspective. This habit persists partly because withholding assent requires effort and tolerance of uncertainty in a culture that rewards quick answers and decisive action, and partly because we have normalized the experience of being swept along by our impressions, treating them as inevitable rather than as optio. Consider the moment when you receive difficult news, perhaps a critical email from your boss or an overheard comment about yourself that troubles you deeply. Your mind immediately constructs a complete narrative around this single impression. You imagine consequences that have not yet occurred. You predict rejection that may never come. You build an entire emotional architecture upon the foundation of one initial perception. The Stoics understood that this first flash of judgment, what they called the impression or fantasia, arrives in your mind unbidden and feels absolutely true in that moment of arrival. Yet here lies the critical distinction that changes everything. The impression itself is not the reality. Between the event and your suffering stands this single, fragile layer, your judgment about what the impression means. Marcus Aurelius taught that you possess the power to examine each impression as it emerges, to hold it up to scrutiny, to question whether it truly represents what you believe it represents. When you test your impression rather than immediately accepting it, you engage in an act of profound freedom. You might ask yourself whether the tone you detected in that comment truly indicated contempt, or whether your own anxiety simply interpreted neutral words through a lens of fear. You might examine whether the worst outcome you imagined is actually probable or merely possible. This practice of testing impressions persists as one of the most underutilized tools in modern psychology, despite its logical soundness and empirical support. We have somehow normalized the acceptance of our first thoughts as gospel truth, treating our immediate reactions as if they were windows onto reality rather than interpretations filtered through our mood, our history, and our current emotional state. Consider the moment when you hear news that troubles you, when someone tells you something about yourself or the world that lands with the weight of certainty, and you feel your chest tighten and your mind begin to spiral into worry and rumination. In that moment, what has actually happened is remarkably simple. Information has entered your awareness, and you have immediately fused it with your emotional reaction to it, creating what feels like a unified truth. You have not separated the fact from the interpretation, the event from the meaning you have assigned to it, and this failure to distinguish between these two categories is the root of most unnecessary suffering. The Stoic practice of separating fact from opinion requires you to pause and ask yourself, what has objectively occurred, and what story am I telling myself about what has occurred? Perhaps someone frowned at you in a meeting. This is the fact. That they are displeased with you or judging your work is the opinion, the inference, the layer of meaning you have added without evidence. Perhaps you made an error at work. This is the fact. That you are incompetent or that this error defines your worth is the opinion you have constructed. The mechanism at work here is the mind's natural tendency to seek patterns and create narratives, for our survival once depended on our ability to read threats in ambiguous information, to leap to conclusions that might protect us from danger. Yet in modern life, this same mechanism that once served us now torments us, because we have forgotten that we built these narratives ourselves and mistaken them for reality itself. We have normalized the collapse of fact and opinion so thoroughly that we rarely notice it happening, and we move through our days believing that our interpretations are simply the truth of how things are, when in reality they are only one possible reading among many. Consider the moment when you receive news that seems neither fortunate nor unfortunate, a circumstance that sits perfectly balanced between what you might call good and what you might call bad, and observe how your mind immediately begins to work, searching for a way to tip the scales in one direction or the other, unable to tolerate the neutrality that stands before you. When a friend cancels plans, when you receive a mediocre evaluation at work, when the weather shifts in an unexpected way, when a relationship ends without drama or clear resolution, the mind does not rest in the simple fact of what has occurred, but rather spins elaborate narratives about what this thing means for your future, your worth, your prospects, creating layers of emotional significance on top of what is merely circumstantial and neutral. The Stoics understood that most events in life possess no inherent moral quality, no built-in goodness or badness, and that we overlay these judgments according to our preferences, our fears, our attachments to how we believe things should unfold. A delay in your schedule might be called bad because you are impatient, yet that same delay might later prove fortunate because it prevented you from being somewhere dangerous, and the event itself remains unmoved by these interpretations, indifferent to the meaning you assign. Yet despite centuries of this teaching filtering through philosophy and psychology, we continue to immediately judge and categorize, to feel the emotional weight of events long before we have gathered enough information to understand their actual consequences, treating our initial reactions as though they were facts rather than preferences. The practice of noticing this habit, of pausing when you encounter something that feels neither clearly good nor clearly bad, and allowing it simply to be itself without your judgment layering meaning onto it, gradually teaches your nervous system that neutrality is not a. Consider the modern person who finds themselves consumed by the pursuit of wealth, believing that the accumulation of money represents the ultimate good, the final answer to all human suffering and uncertainty. They sacrifice their sleep, their relationships, their peace of mind, and often their physical health itself in the relentless chase for financial security and material prosperity. They rise early, work late, skip meals, sit hunched before screens, and postpone the very activities that might restore their body and mind, all in service of acquiring more money. Yet the Stoic philosopher observes something curious and deeply important here. The pursuit of wealth often comes at the direct expense of health, and health itself cannot be reliably secured through wealth alone. A person may accumulate tremendous resources, yet find themselves unable to purchase genuine vitality, true peace, or the absence of suffering when illness strikes. The mechanism at work is a fundamental confusion about what actually lies within our control and what does not. Health and wealth both depend partly on external circumstances beyond our influence: genetics, unexpected illness, market forces, loss, and time itself. Neither can be guaranteed through effort alone, and neither represents a true good in the Stoic sense, because neither is entirely under our rational control. What we can control is our judgment about them, our response to having them or losing them, our virtue in pursuing them wisely or releasing our attachment to them. Yet society has normalized an intense hierarchy of values in which we treat money as sacred and health as negotiable, as though we might trade away decades of vitality for the promise of financial comfort. We have accepted this backwards logic so thoroughly that we rarely question it, rarely notice the fundamental absurdity of destroying our health in pursuit of the wealth we imagine will restore it. Consider the person who lies awake at night, replaying a conversation from years ago, tormented by the thought that someone somewhere might have formed an unfavorable opinion of them based on a single misunderstood remark or moment of awkwardness. They imagine how this person has shared their interpretation with others, how the story has grown and shifted, how their name is now attached to some narrative they never intended to create and cannot control. The anxiety is real, the suffering is tangible, yet the thing being protected, this reputation, this collection of other people's thoughts about who they are, has never truly existed as anything more than a phantom. What you call your reputation is simply the story others are telling themselves in your absence, constructed from fragments of interaction, colored by their own insecurities and biases, completely beyond your reach and ultimately not about you at all. The mechanism at work here is the confusion between your actual character and the reflections of your character in other people's minds, as though these reflections were mirrors of truth rather than distortions shaped by countless variables outside your control. You cannot manage what others think because their thoughts are born from their own experiences, their own wounds, their own filters, their own desperate need to understand the world in ways that feel safe to them. Yet we have built entire lives around the project of managing this unmanageable thing, arranging our words and our appearances and our choices not according to what is right or true, but according to what we imagine might create a favorable impression in the minds of others. We have normalized this exhausting pretense so thoroughly that it feels like virtue, like responsibility, like basic decency, when in truth it is only the theft of our own freedom in service to a mirage. Consider the person who has spent decades building a reputation, climbing social hierarchies, accumulating followers and admirers, only to discover in their final years that none of it has secured anything of lasting value. They find themselves surrounded by people who knew them only as a name, a brand, a public figure, yet never knew them as a human being with fears and doubts and the same fundamental mortality that afflicts us all. The crowds that once cheered have moved on to newer spectacles, newer faces, newer distractions, and the vast apparatus of attention that seemed so real, so substantial, so permanent, has simply evaporated like morning mist under the sun. This is the essential nature of fame, and yet we continue to pursue it as though it were something concrete, something that could be held in the hand and preserved against the passage of time. The mechanism behind this paradox is straightforward enough. We mistake visibility for value, confusing the amount of attention directed toward us with actual worth or security or love. The mind creates a story where being known widely becomes equated with being truly seen, where acclaim becomes confused with genuine connection, where the external validation of strangers begins to feel like proof of our own significance. We have built entire industries, entire social systems, entire lives around the pursuit of this vapor, this illusion of permanence that has never, in the history of human civilization, actually protected anyone from the basic sorrows and uncertainties of existence. Even those who achieve the highest pinnacles of fame discover the same unsettling truth, that the applause is fleeting, that the attention is fickle, that what seemed like an eternal monument to their existence can fade into obscurity within a generation or two. Consider the moment when a leaf falls from a tree in autumn, when its vibrant green surrenders to brown and gold, when it drifts downward and settles upon the earth below, gradually breaking apart and returning to soil from which new life will one day grow. We do not mourn this leaf as lost, though it is no longer what it was. We understand intuitively that it has not disappeared, but rather transformed, becoming nutrients for fungi and insects, minerals for roots, carbon for atmosphere. Yet when we contemplate our own mortality, we recoil from this same principle that governs all of nature. The ancient Stoics understood what modern science has confirmed, that nothing is ever truly lost, only rearranged. The atoms that comprise your body have existed for billions of years, cycling through stars and seas and countless other forms before assembling into the specific consciousness that reads these words. When your body ceases to function, these atoms do not vanish into non-existence. They continue their eternal journey through the universe, becoming part of soil and air and water, eventually entering new organisms, new beings. The carbon in your bones may become the bark of a forest, the iron in your blood may become rust upon ancient stones. Death is not an ending but a dispersal, a return to the fundamental elements from which you emerged. The fear we harbor around death often stems from our stubborn attachment to a singular, unchanging form, from our resistance to the transformation that is the true nature of all existence. We have constructed elaborate psychological barriers against accepting that change is not tragedy but law, that our bodies are not prisons of identity but temporary vessels moving through an endless cycle of becoming. Even in the face of this logical understanding, we persist in treating death as aberration rather than inevitability, as interruption rather than continuation. Consider the moment when you lie awake in the darkness, your mind cycling through imagined futures that have not yet occurred and may never occur at all, each scenario more troubling than the last, each one pulling your attention deeper into a spiral of worry about circumstances entirely beyond your control. You rehearse conversations that will never happen in precisely the way you imagine them. You anticipate rejections that exist only in your mind. You construct elaborate narratives of failure and loss and humiliation, all of it happening in real time while your body lies still in bed, unable to act, unable to change anything, only able to suffer through the internal theater of your own imagination. This is the peculiar torture we inflict upon ourselves, the fear that has no immediate object because it dwells entirely in the realm of possibility rather than reality. The Stoics understood something profound about this condition. That fear is ultimately the fear of what we imagine we cannot endure, not the fear of what is actually happening to us in this present moment. When you examine the structure of your worry with genuine honesty, you discover that fear requires a narrative, a story about a future self who will be unable to cope, who will collapse under pressure, who will be diminished or destroyed by circumstance. Yet this imagined future self possesses no more reality than the characters in a dream, and you grant it power only through the persistent act of your attention. The mechanism is subtle but relentless. We believe that by worrying in advance, by rehearsing worst-case scenarios, we somehow prepare ourselves or gain control, when in truth we accomplish only the theft of our present peace. The remarkable thing is how deeply this pattern is woven into our culture and psychology, normalized to the point where we barely notice we are doing it, where we mistake anxiety for prudence and fearfulness for realism.